Hey everyone, what's going on? Figured I'd try and make a video. It's been a really long time, but my kids are at school and I finally have the house to myself for a tiny bit for the first time in a while. And I still have a blog. I've been blogging tons of stuff, but in this video I want to talk about this number 324. It seems to be this humongous number that since last March I've just been seeing. I've had synchronicities with it. It just seems to be this big important number. It's important to Charlie Kirk and South Park and the Mormon church shooting and the Mormon narrative. There's this big thing that is going on with this number 324. And it seems to correspond to this my last video that I made, these last few videos that I did make back in April and May, and it has to do with this horse narrative that also has to do with volcanoes and father symbolism. And if you go and watch this video, I'm talking about the connection to this year's Kentucky Derby and how it was related to the 2019 Kentucky Derby. And the 2019 Kentucky Derby was all about volcano symbolism and Tisha B'Av, which is the Jewish fast day where they remember the destruction of the two temples in history. And that was important to the 2019 Kentucky Derby because the horse that won was Country House, and the jockey just so happened to be a guy named Flavian Pratt. And this stood out to me because the Flavian dynasty was where the ruler Titus had ruled, and Titus was the ruler who destroyed the second temple in Jerusalem. He was also the ruler during the Mount Vesuvius, a volcano eruption that destroyed Pompeii, right? And there was also another horse in that 2019 Kentucky Derby whose name was Tacitus, who said he owed his rank. It goes back to this guy who said he owed his rank to the Flavian dynasty, right? So there was a big connection. And in 2019, we were following this big narrative with Tisha B'Av, this community, the Gematria community. A big thing that we were following was the 2019 Tisha B'Av. And in relation to horses, it is interesting because the god who loves horses is Neptune, the god of earthquakes, the sea, and a lover of horses is the god Neptune. And think about Tisha B'Av in relation, the two temples that both fell on the 9th day of the 11th month of the Hebrew civil calendar. And think about that in relation to 9/11 and how Osama bin Laden was supposedly killed on an operation called Operation Neptune Spear. Further, in 2019, the original favorite to win the Kentucky Derby was a horse named Omaha Beach. Omaha Beach. And think about Omaha Beach in relation to D-Day. And that also was called Operation Neptune, right? The Normandy landings was called Operation Neptune. And once again, Neptune is the god who loves horses. Further, the horse that won this year, Sovereignty, was trained by William Mott. And this just so happened to be the same guy who trained Country House, who won in 2019. And the reason Country House won was because Maximum Security got disqualified. And remember that shortly after the 2019 Kentucky Derby, there was a story about a plane skidding off the runway in Florida, and it was coming from Guantanamo Bay, a Maximum Security. Well, fast forward to 2025, the day after the Kentucky Derby, Donald Trump wanted to reopen Alcatraz, and Alcatraz just so happens to be a maximum security, right? So you knew there was a connection to the 2019 Kentucky Derby, and Alcatraz just so happened to, what is it? It opened on August 11th, which August 11th was the big day in 2019 where everybody was following with Tisha B'Av. And this is when I started pointing out how Tisha B'Av in 2025 fell on August 2nd, and Alcatraz equals 82 like August 2nd. Tisha B'Av equals 82 like August 2nd. The word volcano equals 82. Think about Titus and the volcano symbolism. And I had been following volcano symbolism previously in connection to J.D. Vance and my book. And a couple years ago, the Kentucky Derby was linked to my book called The Synchro Mystic. And then Mystic Dan ended up winning that Kentucky Derby. And the cover of my book is all about the number 86. And that's because I was following Tisha B'Av in 2022 that just so happened to fall on the date August 6th. And I'll get into it later as we go, but that is the day that South Park had the episode with Charlie Kirk in it that had a lot to do with the number 324 and also volcano symbolism. And then Charlie Kirk died 35 days later in a span of 35 days before his birthday, and the word volcano also equals 35. Of course, South Park has an episode called Volcano. I think it's the second episode, and a volcano erupts and it hits Denver, which I will get to because the Denver Broncos are super linked to this number 324. Of course, Vulcan is the god of volcanoes and fire. And remember on 324, a few years back, the Denver Broncos had a stadium fire. And what's even more interesting is on the date August 6th this year, the building, the gas station right next to where I work, burnt down. And it was a big old thing. That gas station ended up burning down. And that on August 2nd this year, I talked about this movie that came out called The Ritual about the Earling, Iowa exorcism. And I even talked about how a few years ago when I was writing my book and I was talking about this, the gas station blew up in this small town, Earling, Iowa. So then on August 6th, the gas station started on fire and almost blew up in, right next to where I work. Fire, volcanoes, and they pushed this movie back. It was supposed to release on April 18th, and they ended up releasing it on D-Day, once again going along with that Titus and that volcano narrative that I'm talking about. And there's more to it because there's this volcano symbolism that I talked about in 2021 with the birth of my son and Will Ferrell, the movie Eurovision Song Contest, where it opens up and he's singing the song called Volcano Man and he's from Iceland. And then like hours later, the headline story in the news was that a volcano had erupted in Iceland. And the antagonist in that film, Eurovision Song Contest, just so happens to be the priest that is in this movie. And a whole lot more, I'm talking about father symbolism, think about priests. And a former priest from this town ended up dying on my father's birthday this year, just before this movie came out too. What are the odds a former priest from this really small town of probably like 200 or 300 people ends up dying on my father's birthday right before a movie about an exorcism that happened in like 1928, what are the odds a priest from the town would die? But I'm going to go back to the year 2014 and just explain this horse theme again and kind of how I have pieced this together and how it has made sense. Because 2014 was the year that I learned about Neptune being the lover of horses. And 2014 also just so happened to be a Chinese horse year in astrology. And remember the word Philip? Prince Philip? Right? The word Philip actually means lover of horses. And it's interesting because the day that Prince Philip died, there was another headline story about a volcano that erupted. And of course, I talked about this in the months leading up to this because he died during a Chinese year of an ox, and the ox and the horse are the greatest enemies. So it was fitting for him to die that year, the year of the horse, considering his name means lover of horses. My friend Phil also got in a ATV accident that same year, and he's now paralyzed, and he actually loves horses, and his name's Phil. It's crazy. And in 2026, we're coming up on the year of the horse as well. In 2026 will be the year of the horse. just after the Super Bowl this year. But if you go back to 2013, late 2013, when we had like the death of Paul Walker, right? Right after the death of Paul Walker, that's when myself and other people that I was following on YouTube at the time, like Enter the Stars and a guy named Veritas77 Axiom, we were pointing out how there was a Phil theme in the news right after Paul Walker had died. Of course, Paul Walker, you know, was in the movie called The Skulls, where they give him the red Porsche, and then he dies in like a red Porsche. And this was just after Family Guy had released the where the dog had died, the episode where the dog named Brian died. And Paul Walker is mostly known as being Brian on Fast and the Furious, right? The car movie, The Life of Brian. So they kill Brian by getting hit by a car, and then Paul Walker dies. I mean, just all kinds of stuff. But right after Paul Walker died, which is a really big thing, it reminds me of Charlie Kirk. That's why I'm bringing it up. You know, it was like one of the big celebrity deaths that a lot of people still talk about to this day. But right after that, we had all these stories. Like, there was a story about the Duck Dynasty star, Phil Robertson, being suspended because he talked bad about gay people. And then just after that, we got a story about Uncle Phil from Fresh Prince, James Avery. He died. Uncle Phil, of course, think about Philadelphia, the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air from West Philadelphia. And then we had the Super Bowl that year, and the Super Bowl just so happened to be the Denver Broncos, right? The Broncos versus the Seahawks. And think about that in relation to Neptune, who is the god of the sea, earthquakes, and lover of horses, right? The Bronco was a horse, the Seahawks. This was during a Chinese horse year. But during the Super Bowl pregame show, there was this guy from American Idol named Philip Phillips who was performing a song called Gone, Gone, Gone. And right around the time that he was performing this was when the news broke that the actor Philip Seymour Hoffman had died. So a guy named Philip Phillips is singing at the Broncos Seahawks Super Bowl during the horse year. And then they announced that Philip Seymour Hoffman had died. And remember, Philip means lover of horses. And notice that Philip Seymour Hoffman was born on July 23rd, which just so happens to be Neptunalia. July 23rd. And notice Neptune holds the trident, right? Neptune holds the trident. If you go back and watch that Super Bowl, a big commercial in that Super Bowl was a Maserati commercial, and it had the trident, and it said, "Now we strike. Now we strike." So they even had a commercial with the trident that was reminding us of Neptune. So way back in 2014, we were trying to figure out the purpose of what the Neptune related to. And remember, Enter the Stars had pointed out how the coat of arms for Ukraine just so happened to be the trident, which is interesting in relation to how sovereignty was related to the war in Russia and Ukraine. And remember, right after the war in Ukraine started, South Park released the episode called Back to the Cold War that was all about Vladimir Putin and horses, right? Vladimir Putin and horses. Vladimir Putin also is a lover of horses. And even if you go back and look around the time of Russia invading Ukraine, look, I'm talking about Neptune. They nullified Medina Spirit's win. I'm talking about synchronicity with a horse theme. I also, there's a Family Guy episode where Peter and Vladimir Putin ride horses. And I had made a video about this years ago, and someone left a comment saying, "But what are you going to Google when Putin arrives on a plane?" And then the very next day, the headline story of the news was a Russian plane fire. And when I went and looked up the clip, it just so happened to be a thing of Russia or Putin and Peter riding horses. So there's definitely a connection here to horses and Russia and Ukraine. Another thing that we talked about in 2014 was the flag of Barbados. And the flag of Barbados also has a trident on it. And probably the most famous person that I know from Barbados just so happens to be Rihanna, right? Rihanna. And Rihanna just so happens to have this song called Diamonds, right? The very famous song called Diamonds. And in that song, she brings back a horse. She brings a horse back to life. And then later in the video, she's laying in the water, like she's in the shape of a cross, laying in the water. And think about that in relation to Neptune and the sea. She revives a horse. The song is called Diamonds. I looked up Neptune at the time, and some scientists even believe that it rains diamonds on Neptune. So I always had this association with Rihanna, the flag of Barbados, and how she was related to this theme with Neptune. And then you fast forward to just after the Kentucky Derby this year, and we had the story that Rihanna's father had died in the news. Rihanna's father ended up dying right after the Kentucky Derby this year, synced to that 2014 narrative that I'm talking about with horses and so on. Notice I even talked about Rihanna in my video about the sovereignty win in the Kentucky Derby and so on. And I talked about how it was connected to a horse theme. So what are the odds Rihanna's father would then go on to die? And her father's name just so happens to sum to 324. There's some other things in here that I'll talk about, but notice her father's name, Ronald Fainty, equals 324. And I'll come back and explain the 324, but just wanted to point out that Rihanna's father ended up dying. And another thing that happened, let me see if I can find it here. Another thing that happened was, I was talking about how, look, the Duck Dynasty, Phil Robertson died. The Duck Dynasty guy. Remember how Super Bowl 48 was linked up to the Phil theme? And this guy was suspended or whatever because he had anti-gay remarks, and then he ends up dying after the Kentucky Derby this year. Duck Dynasty. And he also had this connection to this big number with Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. His birthday is April 24th, 424. And sovereignty, if you write out sovereignty in all capital letters, it equals 424. The horse who won the Kentucky Derby. If you write out Donald Trump in all capital letters, his name equals 424. And it's important because think about the capital insurrection. So they were telling us to pay attention to capital letters. And these Francis Bacon capital letter ciphers are important to capital letters. And what's interesting is I learned about the importance of these ciphers and how important they were because of 2019 Tisha B'Av. Also, this 424 with Donald Trump goes back to the rabbis from Ukraine who were telling Donald Trump that he was like the savior of Ukraine because in the Hebrew letters, his name sums to 424. And Donald Trump touched the Western Wall on May 22nd, 2017, and he touched it at exactly 4:24 p.m., according to the news article. And that just so happened to be 811 days before August 11th, 2019. So it was 811 days, and that was Tisha B'Av in 2019. And believe it or not, if you go back 424 days from August 11th, 2019, it takes you to June 14th, which is Donald Trump's birthday. And if you go forward 424 days, it takes you to Vladimir Putin's birthday. And I mean, 424 is just stupidly humongous around Donald Trump. His ex-wife ended up dying 4 months and 24 days after her birthday, and all kinds of things with this number 424 around Donald Trump. So no doubt it made sense that Phil Robertson would die, connected to this horse theme that's connected to Ukraine and Russia, and his birthday is 424. Further, the favorite to win the 2019 Kentucky Derby was Omaha Beach, who equals 424, and that horse was also born on 424. This horse was also trained by Richard Mandela, and think about the Mandela effect and so on, but Russia invaded Ukraine 4 months, 24 days before Nelson Mandela's birthday. There's a big old narrative here, but a lot of it had to do with the Mandela effect. And it went back to the song "We Are the Champions" that Donald Trump came out to at his Republican National Convention on Nelson Mandela's birthday in 2016. And this song, the single, just so happened to release on Vladimir Putin's birthday. And many people even have pointed out how the robot or whatever this is, it kind of looks like Vladimir Putin. Also, Nelson Mandela died 424 days after Vladimir Putin's birthday. And to where it ties into a duck theme is the fact that at the end of the movie The Mighty Ducks 2, they're around a campfire and they're singing the song "We Are the Champions," and they say "of the world" as the movie ends. And the Mandela effect that people believe with "We Are the Champions" is that they always said "of the world" as the song finished. And now if you listen to the song, it doesn't do that. But on the movie The Mighty Ducks 2, the movie actually fades out with them singing "of the world." So there was a duck theme that was involved with this. And think about Omaha Beach, who was trained by Richard Mandela. So that's what I was blogging about here. And then, only for a few days later, we get the death of the Duck Dynasty star. And then after he died, I made a blog post and I sat down to watch Supernatural. And the episode just so happened to be called Dark Dynasty. The next episode that I was on, Dark Dynasty, and it's even a play on Duck Dynasty. It's just unbelievable. But then we got the death of the actor who played Howard the Duck, right? Howard the Duck died. So once again, I'm blogging about these things, and then all of a sudden, all these things connected to it seem to be happening. Then Rihanna's father ended up dying. Rihanna connected to that Neptune horse narrative. I even talked about part of the Mandela effect from 2019 had to do with this movie Time Rider, The Adventures of Lyle Swan or Lynn Swan. And I went back and looked at all my old videos, and I thought it was funny because a bunch of them, I mentioned the date August 2nd. And Tisha B'Av this year just so happened to begin on August 2nd. And, we also, right around the same time, we got the death of Rick Derringer. And before 2019, Tisha B'Av, I was talking about Hulk Hogan and how Hulk Hogan got his revenge against Earthquake at the Spectrum in Philadelphia, which is the city of brotherly love. And Hulk Hogan always said brother, and a big old narrative. And for years, I've been blogging about this and making videos talking about the connection to the Third Temple and how it's related to Happy Gilmore. And when he learns how to putt on the Earthquake golf course, the building that falls over has the cube on the top of it that looks like the third, the Third Temple is supposedly a cube, right? Or not the Third Temple, but the New Jerusalem is a cube, right? So the Comcast Center in Philadelphia has the cube on the top. Happy Gilmore learns how to putt on the Earthquake golf course that knocks over the building that looks like the Comcast Center in Philadelphia, where Hulk Hogan got his revenge. Just this big old narrative that I have followed for years. And Rick Derringer was important to that because Rick Derringer wrote the theme song for Hulk Hogan, right? I Am a Real American. And then what do you get? This summer, Hulk Hogan goes on to die like the day before or the day after Happy Gilmore 2 comes out. It's just insane. I mean, all these narratives that I was following from 2019. If you go back to 2019, I was talking a lot about the Earling exorcism, right? These videos that I had. The Earling exorcism. I don't know where I put it. But they just released that movie called The Ritual with Al Pacino that was about the Earling, Iowa exorcism. And I'm telling you, this town is like stupidly small. Earling, Iowa. So it's crazy there'd be a hedge, 397 people. So there's a movie that involves this town in the mainstream right now. But I'm bringing that up because in 2019 in March, I had a bunch of synchronicity at the bar that I was DJing at called Cheers, and all of that had to do with the number 310. And I pointed out how the last time I talked about this number 310 was years before, where I noticed that there was this narrative with Earling, Iowa, and the girl who was exorcised supposedly came from Marathon, Wisconsin, and the town Earling was originally called Marthan because there was but they changed it to Earling because there was already a town named Marathon, and it even says that on their Wikipedia page somewhere here. Yeah, however, there was already a town called Marathon in Iowa, so they changed their name to Earling because of a town already being named Marathon in Iowa, and the girl who was exorcised supposedly came from Marathon, Wisconsin, and her name equaled 310, and the word marathon equals 310, and a couple years later when I was writing about this stuff in my book, the gas station in that town blew up, and the gas station was called Earling Standard that equaled 310. But in 2019, when I was following this big narrative, when I had synchronicity at this bar called Cheers, we got the death of Nipsey Hussle, and Nipsey Hussle just so happened to own a Marathon clothing line, and everything about him, his albums were called Marathon, so I knew there was some important thing in connection to this Earling, Iowa exorcism and how it related. And I even talked about the guy Norm from Cheers around that time because one of my best friends, his nickname is Norm, and he partially got the nickname from Norm from Cheers, but his dad also lives in Norman, Oklahoma. But, Norm from Cheers. So I talked about Norm from Cheers in 2019 before the Tisha B'Av, and I was talking about with the Earling, Iowa stuff. And then, lo and behold, after the Kentucky Derby in 2025, we get the death of Norm from Cheers, right? Then in the summer of 2025, the owner of Cheers ended up being found guilty of third-degree sexual assault, and now he's going to prison. And what's interesting is the girl that accused him, her boyfriend at the time was, and she has a kid with him, was from Earling, Iowa. And the same day that he was found guilty, July 11th, her boyfriend was in Omaha, and he drove up the wrong way in downtown Omaha, and he got in a car wreck and it killed people. But it's like, what are the odds that the same day that the Cheers owner gets sentenced for sexually assaulting a girl, her boyfriend at the time, who she has a kid with, also got in a car wreck and ended up going to jail and had a $1 million bail, or bond. I mean, just what are the odds of that stuff? But once again, I'm just bringing that all back because of the fact that Norm on Cheers died. So once again, I had synchronicity with Cheers, and it had to do with the number 310 back in 2019. And I was talking about the Earling, Iowa stuff and the exorcism. And then this year they released a movie called The Ritual with Al Pacino. And, then all this stuff happens in connection to Earling, Iowa. And even more weird is the girl who had the exorcism was Emma Schmidt. And the girl who the owner of Cheers sexually assaulted, her name was also Emma. You can't even make this stuff up. And Tim also just got sentenced on October 3rd, right? The same day as Puff Daddy. It's all by the number 42 and whatever, but has to do with the same thing in OJ. But you could write the date October 10th or October 3rd as 3-10, like 310. And Tim, the owner of Cheers, his full name equals 310, right? But to tie this together even more is in June, we got this story about Al Pacino, right? The star of the movie The Ritual. Al Pacino got to meet the new Pope. And the reason that he got to meet the new Pope was because he was near the Vatican in Rome or wherever he was. filming this movie called Maserati the Brothers, right? What are the odds? Think about it. Maserati. Remember, Maserati had the commercial with the trident where they say, "Now we strike" at Super Bowl 48, that all had to do with the horse symbolism. I mean, it's crazy. Al Pacino meets the Pope because of the Maserati brothers. Talked about this movie being important because they released it on June 6th, which is D-Day, which goes back to that horse theme with Omaha Beach and the Kentucky Derby, and how the Kentucky Derby this year was connected to the Kentucky Derby in 2019. It's all to do with father and volcano symbolism. Then a priest from Earling, Iowa died on my father's birthday. Then Al Pacino meets the father, the Pope, 66 days after my dad's birthday. My dad's name equals 66. Earling equals 66. Earling, Iowa equals 66. The priest from that town at the time was named 56. The priest who died, Father Berner's name equals 66. They released this movie on 6/6. I mean, there's something going on here, you know. I even go on to talk about all the stuff with Neptune and horses and the Broncos playing the Seahawks. Talk about Rihanna losing her father, priests and fathers. There's even, if you look at the accounts of that girl Emma Schmidt, some of the accounts even say that she died on July 23rd, which is Neptune-Earling. So hopefully you can see how a lot of these things coincide, you know. And I was watching Tisha B'Av, right? And then this year on Tisha B'Av, I actually had a band gig that I was supposed to play at Cheers that day, but it got canceled because the owner had went to jail. And I ended up going to my brother's house, and there's a whole bunch of stuff with that. Instead of going the normal way, we went through Beebeetown, Iowa, which is where I saw a UFO on September 10th, 2001. And it followed us all the way to Council Bluffs, and it's a floating metal H. Talked about this a ton of times. There's a bunch of lights all over the sky. I slept there was no cell phones back in the day, so you couldn't take pictures or anything. And, but I ended up sleeping in my best friend's bedroom that night at our apartment at Sherwood Apartments in Council Bluffs. And the next day we woke up, and that's when we saw the planes supposedly hit the towers and so on. And then George Bush came to Offutt Air Force Base, which is right next to where, really close to where I lived. And, there's always been something fishy. Honestly, if you look at all the drones and stuff that people have been posting about in New Jersey and all that in the last year or so, it looked like something like that. But it was September 10th, 2001. And it was as low as a telephone pole. So it was probably some type of drone back then, but I thought it was aliens or something back then, But the moral of the story is, instead of going to my brother's house the normal way, we went this other way through that town, which has the connection to 9/11, and think about Tisha B'Av in relation to the two towers that fell on the 9th day of the 11th month and so on, 9/11. And also earlier in that day, the lady that I worked with, she brought up Father Paul, like this priest who, he died, but he was a Jesuit actually, but probably the best priest that we've ever had in this town that I remember, one of the nicest dudes ever. I wish he was still alive, because I would seriously go talk to this guy about all the stuff that I'm talking about now, and I bet you $1 million he would be so cool about it. Maybe not even know about it, but this guy was definitely the coolest priest I've ever had growing up as a kid. But basically, just to show how much that he had put a dent on the town that I live in, is that when I was at work that day on Tisha B'Av, the older lady Patty was up front, and some guy asked her, his name was Bill Day, and he was just in the store, and he told her that he went to high school with Father Paul. And she just thought it was so cool, that she met some guy who knew Father Paul and went to high school with him, and she had to come back and tell me, all about it, how this guy knew Father Paul and whatever else, because that's how much of people enjoyed him in this town, But it was just interesting that it would happen on Tisha B'Av that they would bring up this father stuff. And if you go back to 2017, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's related to this, and The Price is Right, and so on, that I was following because of the Manhattan shooter. It's just so deep. I will explain this a little bit more, but the whole point, like that Manhattan shooter also went to the same school as John Elway, the Denver Bronco, the guy connected to horses. But they said he was trying to shoot up the NFL people and so on, right? They're trying to shoot the NFL people who went to the same high school as John Elway. Actually, you know what? I'll just go back and explain it really quick. So in July, when we had this Midtown Manhattan shooter, let's see here. In July, we had the Midtown Manhattan shooter. Let me see if I can just find a picture of him real quick. This guy, he supposedly was trying to kill the people at the NFL office. And if you look him up, he went to the same high school as John Elway. But the day that that happened, I was at my parents' house actually, and my phone rang, and it was a New York number. And then it rang, I hung up, and then it rang right away again from another New York number. And this happens a lot, actually. Almost every day I'll get like a phone call from somewhere, and if I hang it up right away, then they call me back within like 30 seconds, and then I don't get another call from them. But that particular day, that happened, and then I went and I sat down at the table, and then my phone rang again, and it was from a different New York number. And I was sitting there talking to my mom, and I told my mom, I was like, you just wait. I was like, this doesn't happen very often. I go, wait, I bet you $1 million either tomorrow or later tonight, there'll be a headline story about something, some shooting or something that happened in New York. And I went on to tell my mom about 2017, the year I was following all this priest symbolism that had to do with Father Paul, the guy I'm talking about from August 2nd. But it had all to do with him, and him, you know, he was a Jesuit and died 6 months, 3 days after the Jesuit anniversary at the age of 63. And then I noticed all the priests in my town all had a connection to the number 63, such as Father Fitzgerald got kicked out for molesting at the age of 63, and friendly Father Fred died on the 63rd day of the year, and so on. And anyway, in 2017, I was following the Jesuit anniversary because of all this father symbolism. And on that day, I got a phone call from Las Vegas, and it was the only phone call that I got. And I thought I didn't think that much of it. I was just like, I don't know, Las Vegas. And then a few days later, on September 30th, the guy who got the perfect showcase on The Price is Right reached out to me. His name was Terry Neese, and he wanted to tell me all about his story and so on. And that's because earlier in the year, I had blogged about Terry Neese in relation to Bob Barker, and how Bob Barker grew up in Rosebud Indian Reservation where Father Paul had went. And Father Paul always talked about this Rosebud Indian Reservation, and I was talking about Bob Barker. So then the guy from The Price is Right, Terry Neese, who got the perfect showcase on The Price is Right, reaches out to me the day before the Las Vegas attack. And, you know, the Jason Aldean Las Vegas attack. And if you watch that episode of The Price is Right, he's wearing a shirt that says Las Vegas on it, and he's also from Las Vegas. And it was like, what are the odds this guy from Las Vegas reaches out to me the day before the Las Vegas attack, and I'm watching for it with the father symbolism, and on the Jesuit anniversary, somebody from Las Vegas called me, then we get the Las Vegas attack. And then I was thinking about how Happy Gilmore had just came out. Happy Gilmore 2 just came out this summer. And then now I'm getting these phone calls from New York. And then a few minutes later, I went to CNN on my phone, and the headline story was that there was a shooting in Midtown Manhattan in New York. And to top it all off, they said the shooter was from Las Vegas. You know what I mean? So I was like, that's crazy, you know. Tell my mom all about this stuff with the Las Vegas and how I got these weird people reaching out to me in phone calls. And then I get them from New York, and I go to CNN, and their headline story is about a shooting in New York, and the shooter is supposedly from Las Vegas. And I know I haven't even started talking about it, but notice that the guy with the perfect showcase on The Price is Right, his name just so happens to equal 324. Midtown Manhattan equals 324. And also, a little bit before this, I had realized that the PDF file that I downloaded on my phone of my book that has all to do, the cover is all about Tisha B'Av in 2022, but I noticed that I downloaded that on my phone on the date 3/24. And this takes me back to, you know, the day of Tisha B'Av when this guy says that he went to high school with Father Paul, right? That was the synchronicity that I had. It was father symbolism on that day. Then later in the day, I end up going to my brother's house for a birthday party instead of playing at Cheers because of the whole arrest thing and how it's connected to Erling, right? And then, of course, we go on the BB Town highway that's connected to 9/11, which is linked back to Tish B'Av. And, there's just so many weird things going on there. Oh, yeah, my grandma. My grandma was supposed to come to that birthday party with us, but instead she stayed in town because the new priest in town was having a birthday party, right? So there's a new priest in the town, and I don't know if it's his actual birthday, it's hard to find, but they were celebrating his birthday that day. So my grandma didn't even go to this because there was a birthday party for the priest in town, and then the priest thing happens at work. All these things. Remember how Erling is related to the father symbolism, right? And I also talked about the number 310 with Erling. There was also a murder in this town on July 31st. Like, what are the odds of that? A murder in this small town? They release a movie about the exorcism, then there's a murder. Then there's another guy from there who, gets in a car wreck in Omaha on the same day that the Cheers owner gets convicted, and he has a connection to him. Dude, we live in the Matrix. There's something not right with all this, but that murder just so happened to be 3 months and 10 days before my birthday. The number 310 yet again. And I'm pretty sure further down here, let me see here. Maybe it was my other post of the day. Yeah, see, I'm talking about the BB Town, Iowa stuff here. Oh. It's actually in this post back here, but I just want to point out August 2nd, Tisha B'Av, and I'm talking about 310, and I'm talking about the gas station that blew up in Erling and how it equaled 310, and, it was all connected to when I was writing my book. And remember, my book is also connected to Tisha B'Av and the date August 6th. And then what happens on August 6th? The gas station right next to my work ends up burning down, right? It's completely burnt down on August 6th. The day I was watching for this day in relation to the Tisha B'Av stuff. Here, I'll show you. This is where I work, and this is what burnt down. Just like the Erling gas station that I had blogged about in relation to the connection to my book and so on. And what's funny is that this is not really, it was more of a auto parts or an auto place, like to fix cars and stuff and tractors and whatever, and less of a gas station, just like the Erling one had a lot to do with that. It was a really small old school gas station, not like a convenience store gas station. So they even had similarities in that. And then they both, explode, or they both burn down in relation to what I am talking about. So hopefully you get the gist of this narrative. I am going to go back and explain this number 324 now because, and try to piece it all together for you. So basically, if you go back to my videos around the time of the Donald Trump assassination attempts, I was talking about how this seemed to be showing us to pay attention to composite numbers and the importance of these ciphers that use composite numbers. And the two big numbers were 418 and 316. And then in March this year, I kept having all of these synchronicities with the number 324. Just towards the end of March, I just kept seeing the number 324 on everything. Like someone called the gas station and asked the price of diesel, and it was $3.24. And then I looked at the timer at work, and it was at 324. And my friend Trevor had just died, and his name summed to 324. And I talked about Star Jones and how it might be important to my blog post about Tracy Morgan, and her birthday was 324. There was just all kinds of things. I kept seeing the number 324. I'd look at the clock, it was 324. And I didn't know what it meant. I just had all these synchronicities. But then there was an earthquake in Myanmar on March 28th. And right away, this just made me think of Zach Hubbard and his sweet lady who is from Myanmar. And keep in mind, this just so happened to be 4 months and 18 days after my birthday, 418. So I thought there has to be something important to composite numbers with this. There has to be some importance to composite things because it has that connection to 418, a big number, with Donald Trump and the composite thing. So this earthquake happening 4 months, 18 days after my birthday seemed to stand out. And I started looking into the story, and I just noticed a whole bunch of interesting things, like how Zach's wife's name equals 261 in the reverse composite cipher, and the 261st composite just so happens to be 328. A lot like the date 328 of this earthquake. And, her name also equals 213, just like earthquake, and, there's a whole bunch of other things here, but I guess I'll just explain a few more things. But I noticed Myanmar equals 170 in the reverse composite cipher. And this is a number that I've talked about in relation to Zach and Sweet Lady over the years. All kinds of stuff, I'm not going to re-explain it all, but the whole point is that I've talked about it a number of times. This number 170 and the connection to Zach, and then his wife is from Myanmar, and Myanmar in these ciphers equals 170. It also equals 142, and the 142nd composite is 185, and in the non-reverse composite cipher, his wife's name equals 185. George Orwell equals 142, and she shares a birthday with George Orwell, and George Orwell used to live in Burma, which is Myanmar, and one of his first books is even called, like, Burma Days, or whatever it's called, So there is this connection to the composite numbers. And this earthquake just so happened to fall 3 months, 24 days before Zach's birthday, like the number 324. And for years, Zach went by Zachary K. Hubbard on YouTube. That was what his channel was called. And when you type that out, his name equals 257, and in reverse, 404. And that's interesting to the number 324 because the 257th composite number is 324, and the 324th composite number is 404. So his name has this super connection in the composite numbers that has a relationship to the number 324. And then this earthquake in Myanmar, where his wife is originally from, happened 3 months, 24 days before his birthday. And then you combine this with how just before all of this, I was having all these synchronicities with the number 324. And then this comes on 4 months, 18 days after my birthday. I knew that this was something that I was supposed to see. Another thing that I was blogging about around this time, a big thing that I kept blogging about was I was having all these synchronicities with Pac-Man, right? With Pac-Man. And Pac-Man doesn't equal 324 in the composite ciphers, but I did notice that if you write out Pac-Man, it does have the connection in the satanic cipher. So it does have a connection to 324. There are a lot of ciphers and so on. So it could be whatever, but it just stands out to me that it has the connection to 324. And also Ukraine does have that connection to 324 in the same cipher. But moral of the story is I was having all these connections with Pac-Man, and I was blogging about how it reminded me of San Francisco and the Golden Gate Bridge, and this has a lot to do with the movie Pixels from 2015, where it has Pac-Man eating the Golden Gate Bridge, but they never go to San Francisco in the movie. This doesn't happen in the movie, So I always thought that was strange that the cover would be Pac-Man eating the Golden Gate Bridge, but then that never happens in the movie. And there was all kinds of things with San Francisco going on in 2015. You had Pope Francis was visiting the United States, and he came on his 923rd day and went to the White House at 9:23 in the morning on 9:23, and a whole bunch of connections to Pope Francis, who's named after St. Francis of Assisi, which San Francisco is also named after. Think about Pope Francis in relation to the Father symbolism. And another thing that, stood out too was that the Super Bowl after 2015, that following year, it was Super Bowl 50 that was held in San Francisco. And the upcoming Super Bowl, Super Bowl 60, is also going to be held in San Francisco. And later, when I started putting this together with all the Tisha B'Av stuff, remember August 11th, 2019, the big day that everybody was following that had a lot to do with Zachary K. Hubbard. It all had to do with San Francisco and the Golden Gate Bridge. And, the Golden Gate is where the Jews believe the Messiah will return through. Think about that in relation to the third temple. And I also blogged about this Pac-Man synchronicity in relation to my girlfriend's stepfather. He had like a brain tumor removed, and I blogged about that as well. So it had to do with father symbolism, right? And what's interesting is that something that he never told us for years, but on August 11th, 2019, the big Tisha B'Av date, Zach Hubbard's sister, who has a different father than him, her father just so happened to die on that day, August 11th, 2019. Her father died that day. And what's interesting about that is that if you go from Zach's father's birthday to that day, it's 3 months and 24 days. And notice his birthday, April 18th. 418, the composite number importance, right? So what are the odds? His birthday, 3 months and 24 days before Zach's sister's father dies on this big day that we're following. This big number, 324, that seems to be connected to Zach through composite numbers. Another thing that made me think of that Tisha B'Av narrative with August 11th is that if you go back right after I was talking about all that, I had all kinds of weird stuff happen to me too. Like, I was driving my girlfriend's sister home and an owl just like flew out of the ditch late at night and it smoked the windshield and I killed an owl, dude. And like, it was the weirdest thing that's ever happened to me. Like, I've seen birds fly out of the ditch, but never an owl. I've never killed an owl. And it was like, what in the world? Then all of a sudden I'm blogging about this exorcism stuff and I'm thinking about the owl and Moloch, and every night I would drive through the town of Earling because she worked in Harlan. And I was like, man, this is some weird stuff that I would run into an owl. And then I realized this movie about the exorcism is coming out. And YouTube also removed one of my Say 10 videos about Marilyn Manson and his song Say 10, right around the same time. But then, well, that's April 8th. So 20 days later, I had a dream about Marilyn Manson and how I was telling him that, maybe it's because of YouTube taking down my video or something, but I was talking about this stuff with Render Judgment and Toby Keith and how it was related to the father symbolism. That there's a whole lot to explain with this, but just Toby Keith was related to a father thing with my own father and whatever. And, but he had a horse called Render Judgment. And then I looked at the word judgment on my blog, and I found that the last time I wrote the word was in this post I had about a dream I had about Marilyn Manson on August 11th of 2024. And I was like, August 11th, right? That big Tisha B'Av date connected to San Francisco and the Golden Gate Bridge and so on. And the reason that it was so interesting was because before I even looked this up, that night I had a dream about Marilyn Manson again, and I was telling him how I knew what the song Satan meant, and he was trying to sew my lips together to keep me quiet and stuff. And I looked that up, and I had that second dream 3 months, 24 days after Marilyn Manson's birthday. It was like 3 months, 24 days later. And then the other one was on August 11th. So once again, this had me thinking about that Tisha B'Av narrative. And then we had the Kentucky Derby that was linked to 2019, just like all the stuff with the Tisha B'Av narrative. And once again, we learned a new, or at least we were supposed to pay attention to the Francis Bacon capital letter ciphers. That is what we were being guided to do with 2019. I'm sure of it. At least for me, I was supposed to learn the importance, and they are so stupidly important all of the time. If you pay attention to the capital letters, it's every single news article or whatever. It always is important to them capital letter ciphers. And with the Donald Trump assassination attempt thing, I really think we were being guided to pay attention to these composite numbers and ciphers. You know, another thing too, in relation to the father symbolism, if you go from Zach's father's birthday to Tisha B'Av this year, it was a span of 3 months and 16 days. That other number, 316 and 418, important to composite numbers, right? And, you know, think about father symbolism yet again with priests and the Pope. And remember, if you go back and watch this video, I'm talking about the connection to Zach talking about Joseph Aquaviva's father and Mark Passio's father, and how it was all related to this number 421. And then Zach did the live stream with a guy named American Fathers 4 months and 21 days after the new Pope's birthday, and a whole bunch of stuff, right? And then the Pope dies on 421, right? But I'm bringing this up because the new Pope is Pope Leo, and his name just so happens to equal 257, and he was born on the 257th day of the year, and the 257th composite just so happens to be 324. So there is something important to the father's symbolism and how it relates to that number, 324. Further, in relation to Neptune, you know, it's interesting that Neptune-Earling begins on July 23rd, or it happens on July 23rd, which is usually during the time of Leo, right? Pope Leo. So Neptune-Earling usually begins right on the cusp of July 23rd. So Pope Leo, and then the horse symbolism. Of course, the Charlie Kirk stuff was linked to Chicago, where the Pope is from. It also had other connections to the Pope, and I'll get to that later, but that also involves the number 324. But then add in the fact that Rihanna's father died earlier this year, and remember Rihanna's father, his name in the composite ciphers just so happened to sum to 324, or I guess in the capital letter ciphers, his name equals 324. And there's some more interesting things here, because in this same post I also talked about Klay Thompson's dog, and that was because Zach had a video about Rihanna's father and Klay Thompson's dog. But if you followed me over the years, I actually know a guy named Klay Thompson who his nickname is Dogger, and he died in connection to Klay Thompson. I've always called this Klay Thompson Dogger as a joke, because this old drunk guy that I know, his nickname was Dogger and his real name was Klay Thompson. So we've always joked that this Klay Thompson that used to play for the Warriors, we've always called him Dogger. But he now plays for the Dallas Mavericks, whose mascot is the horse. And here, I'll show you what I mean in my old post here. So back in 2022 in November, I had synchronicity with our new dog that we named Chase and Klay Thompson. And I even talked about this guy who we called Dogger, who has the name Klay Thompson, except for he's spelled with a C. And then, lo and behold, Dogger would go on to die in connection to Klay Thompson. Like that post that I had about the synchronicity, it just so happened to be 82 days before the basketball player Klay Thompson's birthday. And then the dogger that I know, Klay Thompson, he died 82 days before his birthday, and the word dogger equals 82. And that's interesting when you go back to this and think about how Klay Thompson's dog just died. And further, if you go back to when I first started thinking about this number 324, notice that I was also talking about a chase theme, right? A chase theme. And my friend Trevor Chase had died, and his name equaled 324. So then Klay Thompson's father dies. It's connected to this guy named Dogger that I know who also has the name Klay Thompson, who loves dogs. And he ended up dying from carbon monoxide poisoning, which I'll get into in just a second. But look at the story of Klay Thompson. It talks about how his father was the one who talked, according to Michael Thompson. So his father was the one who talked about his dog dying. And his father was the one who revealed the death of the dog 82 days after the death date of the dogger that I know, right? So 82 days later, Klay Thompson's father does that. Klay Thompson's father also announced the death of this dog 3 months and 24 days after his birthday, 324. And the dog's name just so happened to equal 324. And Klay Thompson, the guy that I knew, his name equals 324. And, it's interesting that the Klay Thompson that I knew died from carbon monoxide poisoning. And I put this in a post with Rihanna, is the fact that just a few weeks before I blogged about this, let me find it here. So her father died later in May. This is May 12th. But I was blogging about Rihanna and the horse symbolism and how it's connected to Weird Al. And Daniel Radcliffe, who's born on Neptune-Earling, says that he got the part of playing Weird Al partially due to Rihanna. He was on some show and they were advertising this movie where he was a blind guy, or he blinded horses or something. I can't remember the whole thing. But Daniel Radcliffe, born on Neptune-Earling, synced up to Rihanna, that's how he got the part for Weird Al. Weird Al's parents actually died from carbon monoxide poisoning. So I thought that was really weird how I had put them two posts together. Dogger died from carbon monoxide poisoning. Weird Al's. Notice this, the white horse, like the Bronco, or the white horse of Revelation, you could possibly say. And of course, Weird Al admits that he hides the number 27 in all of his things. 27 and 72. Even the new movie with Daniel Radcliffe, there's a bunch of 72s hidden in the background. There's also, or 72s and 27s in that movie. And it's also interesting, the very first video I ever made with like a screencast recorder where I recorded the screen on YouTube, it was a video about Weird Al. And I was talking about Neptune being in Pisces. So it's just interesting, There's something going on here with this, the father symbolism, how it relates to horses. And once again, I'm talking about this narrative with Rihanna, weeks before her father goes on to die. And I'm talking about the father symbolism. So what are the odds that Rihanna's father would then go on to die? Here it is, trying to find that post here. Even more crazy is the fact that when I was making this blog post, I went back and looked up Weird Al's parents' death or whatever. And the old blog post that I have about Weird Al's parents dying from carbon monoxide just so happens to have a picture of a horse on it. I can't even zoom in there, but notice the horse here? Parents of Weird Al. The post I'm talking about had a picture of a horse right next to it. So there's absolutely something going on with the horse theme and how it's related. And, in relation to all the San Francisco stuff, like I said, Super Bowl 60 Super Bowl 60 is going to be held in Levi's Stadium in the San Francisco Bay. And that is also where Super Bowl 50 was held. And Super Bowl 50 just so happened to be the Denver Broncos who won that Super Bowl. And remember how Super Bowl 50 was all synced up to O.J. Simpson? Netflix had released that series about O.J. Simpson just before the Broncos played the Panthers in the Super Bowl of Super Bowl 50. Of course, O.J. got away in the white Bronco, and the Broncos logo was the white horse, the white Bronco. San Francisco Bay is where the Black Panthers were founded, and they were playing the Carolina Panthers, whose star quarterback was Cam Newton, and the founder of the Black Panthers was Huey P. Newton. And it gets even deeper because OJ's name, his real name, Orenthal James Simpson, just so, I'm going to spell it wrong there. Oh, it equals 324, right? His real name, his full real name equals 324. And, Nicole Simpson also equals 324. He supposedly didn't kill her, but whoever killed her, they stabbed her in the neck, reminding us a lot of Charlie Kirk in the movie Snake Eyes and Ryan Ruth, the Donald Trump assassination attempt, trying to stab himself in the neck, right? Think about how OJ also has the ties to San Francisco. Think about how Peyton Manning is also a famous Denver Bronco. And Peyton Manning has the March 24th birthday, 3/24. And remember, I think it was in 2022, there was a stadium fire at the Denver Broncos Stadium on March 24th. And think about O.J. Simpson in relation to the Buffalo Bills as well. And Damar Hamlin collapsing, right? Damar Hamlin's birthday, also March 24th. I also had synchronicity with O.J. Simpson and the white Bronco. Let me see here. Back in November of 2023, I went out to the dollar store or something, and my friend Sturgill, whose birthday is the 324th day of the year, November 20th, whose favorite NFL team is the Cincinnati Bengals, who Damar Hamlin collapsed against, but we'll skip over that. But he had messaged me how Damar Hamlin played against the Broncos last week, and then he didn't suit up, and the Bills player Taylor Rapp had to be taken off the field in an ambulance. And I talked about all the 33 stuff with all that. There's where I talked about the Denver fire, the stadium on 3/24/22. But I was driving home from the dollar store when he texted me that, and I looked down at my phone to read that. And right as I was reading that, a white Bronco that looked like what O.J. Simpson escaped in came over the hill and then kept going down the highway or whatever. So I was like, there was a Bronco that looked like O.J.'s Bronco, right as my friend is texting me about Damar Hamlin, the Buffalo Bills player, and, think about the connection to him and O.J. Simpson to the white Bronco and the Denver Broncos, and he's talking about how he suited up against the Broncos. And then his birthday's the 324th day of the year. And this fire's on 3/24, like Peyton Manning's birthday, like Damar Hamlin's birthday. Talked about how that was also the same day that Jimmy Carter's wife died. And Jimmy Carter's birthday was the day of the Las Vegas attack. And that was also the same day that O.J. Simpson was released from prison after he did that robbery in Las Vegas. So there's a big old narrative here, and then the Cheers guy, my friend Tim, who got sentenced on the same day as Puff Daddy, which is the same day in history that O.J. Simpson was found not guilty, which is also the same day in history that he was found guilty for the Las Vegas thing, right? Whole bunch of stuff going on here, but think about Russell Wilson, right? Think about Peyton Manning, and how Peyton Manning went from the Colts to the Broncos, the two horse teams. And you got Russell Wilson, who was the quarterback in Super Bowl 48 against the Broncos. And then he later went to the Broncos. Now he's for the New York Giants, where Peyton Manning's brother used to be the star quarterback, Eli. And Eli got replaced by Daniel Jones, who left the Giants to now he plays for the Indianapolis Colts, the horse team, right? So Daniel Jones on the Colts, Russell Wilson now for the Giants, and if you write out Russell Wilson, his name equals 324. He was also traded to the Denver Broncos just before the stadium fire on 324. There's also another cipher that I talk about a lot with synchronicity, and the English extended, or it says standard here, but Daniel Jones just so happens to equal 324 in that cipher. That always seems to be linked up to synchronicity, so I just find it's not necessarily related to synchronicity, but it's interesting with my O.J. Simpson synchronicity, and then he has this connection to 324 that all relates back to the Broncos and the Bills and stuff. Maybe I'll talk about this later too, but there was also the year of that Broncos stadium fire was also the same year that there was all of the truth rallies that were going on. And one of the big ones was in Buffalo. And it was all linked up to Vice News, and it had a connection to the Denver Broncos. And it was linked up to Damar Hamlin collapsing and the Buffalo Bills losing 186 days later. Maybe I'll leave a link in the description, but I have a bunch of videos talking about the connection to this. But it's just interesting when I'm talking about the 324 in relation to Zachary K. Hubbard. And, that Buffalo rally began on Josh Allen's birthday, the quarterback for the Buffalo Bills. It was all linked up to Skull and Bones and a whole bunch of stuff. It's just so much to re-explain that you have to just go back and watch the video, but it's talking about the umbrella symbolism and mind control, and then the 9/11 rally. There was the most umbrellas I've ever seen in my entire life. Then the very next day on Andrew Luck's birthday, the guy who played for the Colts, who was connected to the 2016 stuff and the umbrella symbolism. That was his 33rd birthday, and that was the day that Zach decided to go home because he hit like a pothole or something. And the guy named the Umbrella Man on a different channel, he had a video called Skull and Bones that day while Zach had finished his trip at Yale where Skull and Bones is. All kinds of stuff going on with it, but remember in 2019, right after Tisha B'Av, actually it was August 24th, which was the same as 8/11 from the Gregorian to Julian calendar. Something I pointed out all year because the MVP of the Super Bowl in 2019 was Julian Edelman, and Julian Assange got arrested, and a whole bunch of stuff was telling us to pay attention to the Julian calendar. But on August 11th of the Julian calendar, Andrew Luck announced his retirement as well. But maybe I'll come back to this later when it makes more sense, when I start talking about Charlie Kirk and all the Freemason stuff, and it'll make a little bit more sense if I come back then. But just want to show my Rihanna post. I'm talking about all this stuff with the 324 and how it relates to the Buffalo Bills and the Denver Broncos. 324. Let's see here, just scroll up. Talked about Russell Wilson, Super Bowl 48 and 324. There were some other things that were connected to 324, but I'm going to skip over them. It had to do with dreams. I had a dream about a random lady, and I looked it up, and her birthday was like 3 months and 24 days after the dream and stuff. I don't exactly know what it means, but remember the Coldplay stuff, the Jumbotron and the guy being caught on the camera at the Coldplay concert? Well, once again, in relation to Super Bowl 50, the halftime show just so happened to be Coldplay. So there's something going on with this connection to Super Bowl 50, the Broncos, San Francisco, the horse theme. And then you start looking more into this and how Super Bowl 60 is held at Levi's Stadium. And you see this guy here, the CEO, Andy Byron, his birthday is the same day as Pope Leo's, which, that means his birthday this year was on The 257th day of the year, 257th composite is 324. But this happened 60 days before his birthday, and the company was named Astronomer, that equals 60. It was in Gillette Stadium, that equals 60. And the lead singer of Coldplay, Chris Martin, his name also equals 60. And think about that in relation to, Super Bowl 60 and being in Levi's Stadium. And Super Bowl 50 was also in Levi's Stadium, and it links up to that horse theme with the Denver Broncos. And I mean, the word horse also equals 129. And this was 1 month, 29 days before his birthday. And I went on to talk about the horse stuff. It happened on the 197th day of the year. Denver Broncos equals 197. I also pointed out, there's a bunch of other stuff with it. But they released the new Superman movie. And if you go back to look at all my stuff about Super Bowl 50, I also talked about a bunch of stuff about Superman and how Superman. Oh, I can't even remember what even happens. There's something to do with the lights blinding people at Levi's Stadium, the pilots, and Superman in one of the movies, Superman 2 maybe. He saves an airplane from crashing into the stadium or something. I can't remember all of it. Maybe Cam Newton had something to do with Superman. So it's just interesting they released a new Superman film, and then they got this stuff synced up to Super Bowl 50, it seems, with Coldplay. And in relation to Coldplay playing at the Super Bowl 50 halftime show, remember how the beginning of the season began this year, too. The beginning of the NFL season, they had the whole thing where Jalen Carter spit and got ejected, and his birthday was 4-4, and his name equals 44, spit equals 44. They delayed the game due to lightning. Lightning equals 44. The game was delayed with 4:44 in the third quarter, and the Eagles were up by 4. And the total score even summed to 44 points. He spit on Dak Prescott, who wears number 4. Just before the rain delay or the lightning delay, Miles Sanders fumbled his 4th carry. He wears number 24. Jalen Carter was 24. The Eagles had 24 points and were up by 4. The word 4 equals 24. All these 4s in the opening game of the season. But what's interesting is the opening game was on Beyonce's 44th birthday. And this guy's named Jalen Carter. And remember, he was playing the Cowboys. And think about Cowboy Carter and Beyonce and how she played that show on Christmas 4 days before Jimmy Carter had died. I mean, they were doing a total ritual to that. Cowboy Carter, Jalen Carter. On Beyonce's 44th birthday, they do all the 44 and 4 stuff against the Dallas Cowboys. But I'm bringing that up because Beyonce on that album, she has a song called Levi's Jeans, reminding us of Levi's Stadium. And look at the cover. It's the white horse. Once again, there's a connection to this horse theme. The Broncos, who are in Super Bowl 50, also have the white horse logo. And of course, her husband, Jay-Z, also has that album called 4:44. And that came out in 2017 when I was talking about all the father symbolism stuff that was related to the Las Vegas attack that goes back to O.J. Simpson being released from prison on Jimmy Carter's birthday, which was the same day as the Las Vegas attack. And something I forgot? I just realized that I wrote in here. My friend Tim, who went to prison for the sexual assault or whatever, he used to own a Bronco that looked like O.J. Simpson's, right? He even used to own a Bronco that looked like O.J. Simpson's, and then he gets sentenced on October 3rd, the day that O.J. Simpson was found not guilty, and also the day that O.J. Simpson was sentenced or was found not guilty found guilty for his Las Vegas robbery. So whatever he went to jail for, he's either sentenced or convicted on October 3rd. And that was the same day in history that his murder case was found not guilty, but that was the same day that Tim, who owned the Cheers bar, got sentenced to jail. And he used to own a white Bronco that looked like O.J. Simpson's. I mean, what are the odds of that? So there's definitely some connection. You know, it seems like there's a connection to the Super Bowl 50 where the Broncos played in Levi's Stadium. You know, all these things seem to align with what's going on with that, at least to me. You know, and then, like I said, then with the O.J. Simpson stuff, then we got the Manhattan shooter, the Midtown Manhattan shooter, right, where I had synchronicity with. And this guy went to the same high school as John Elway. Trying to find the high school where it says, but
What are you doing?
whatever it is, this high school right here, where it has John Elway Stadium, and that's where John Elway even went to school. So once again, another connection to the Denver Broncos. Think about Omaha Beach too. Omaha Beach, and how Peyton Manning always said Omaha. Another interesting thing in relation to Super Bowl 50 is that not only did Coldplay play at Super Bowl 50, Beyonce was also part of the Super Bowl 50 halftime show. And that Super Bowl was all about the number 4 as well. Let me find it here, but if you go back and look at my old blog posts about that Super Bowl, the big thing was when Cam Newton didn't try to jump on the ball at the very end, and the Broncos got the ball on the 4-yard line with 4:04 left in the fourth quarter, and it was after the Panthers' fourth turnover. And remember the other big number in the Jalen Carter spitting game, or that was a tribute to Cowboy Carter, the other big number was 24. And Super Bowl 50 also had a lot to do with the number 24. Like the Broncos won with 24 points, and at Beyonce's halftime show, she wore the letter X on her outfit, right? And it was to tribute Malcolm X, right? And the Black Panthers and so on. But X is the 24th letter, right? So there's even that connection. And think about how Malcolm X was actually born in Omaha, Nebraska. So there's definitely some parallel going on with the Denver Broncos and Super Bowl 50 in relation to this narrative that I've been following with 324. And then once again, you got the Cowboy Carter album cover that has Beyonce with the white horse, and the white horse is the Denver Broncos logo. But anyway, let's go back to Tisha B'Av again this year. So hopefully I put it all together enough where it kind of makes sense. I know it's confusing. There's a lot of different themes that I'm talking about that all kind of coincide, but think how on Tisha B'Av this year, I had that synchronicity with the father and the priest symbolism. And this guy, Father Paul, had that connection to the year 2017 that had to do with the Vegas attack, which was the same day that O.J. Simpson got out of prison for his robbery in Las Vegas. Then you had the Manhattan shooter, all linked to the Las Vegas stuff. Then you got O.J. Simpson, who is related to the white Bronco, and the Denver Broncos have the white Bronco logo. And then O.J. Simpson is also related to the Buffalo Bills. And O.J. Simpson also has a tie. He used to play in San Francisco as well, which ties it all back together with Super Bowl 50 and Super Bowl 60. So it seems to be like the theme behind this all connects back to O.J. Simpson in some weird way. You know, even my friend Tim and the Earling exorcism stuff, and my friend Tim being sentenced on the same day that O.J. was found not guilty, the same day that Puff Daddy was found guilty, the same day that O.J. was either sentenced or whatever it was for his Las Vegas robbery. That was all on the same day, connected to that number 310, which is connected to the father symbolism as well. And even my dad's father, my grandpa, he died on the date March 10th, 310, right, of 2020. But I guess the moral of the story is I just want to point out how all these things that seem to be pointing to Tisha B'Av had something to do with father symbolism. Then I have synchronicity with father on that day. And Then I talked about the fire stuff, and I was watching for the date August 6th because the cover of my book was about Tisha B'Av of 2022 that fell on August 6th, 2022. And another thing that happened on August 6th was that there was the South Park episode that they, did the joke about Charlie Kirk on. And this was the second episode of South Park this season. The first one just so happened to be called Sermon on the Mount. Get it? Sermon on the Mount. Think about that in relation to Tisha B'Av and the destruction of the two temples and the Temple Mount. And this episode just so happened to release on Neptune-Earling. And it all has to do with Donald Trump, and Donald Trump's boyfriend, girlfriend, or whatever the hell it is Satan, right? And that's a big thing on all the episodes this year. And South Park, in the recent episode, they just made fun of the number 6-7, right? So they're even making fun of numbers and whatever. But I'm just pointing out that it's connected to the horse theme through Neptune-Earling. It's connected to the Tisha B'Av narrative. And then the Charlie Kirk episode just so happened to be on August 6th, which was connected to my book and Tisha B'Av on August 6th, 2022. But Charlie Kirk wasn't the main thing in this episode on August 6th. The main thing they were making fun of was Ice and Kristi Noem. And if you look up Kristi Noem, her birthday is November 30th, which means that this episode that involved Charlie Kirk and her was 3 months and 24 days before her birthday. And in relation to the volcano symbolism that ties along with the Tisha B'Av and Titus, the ruler during Pompeii and the ruler who destroyed the Second Temple in Jerusalem, there's an episode of South Park called Ginger Cow. And that is all about the red heifer prophecy, which the red heifer is what ushers in to the building of the third temple in Jerusalem. So it has to do with Tisha B'Av even in a way, right? There's an episode called Ginger Cow. And the big thing that gives the peace to the whole world is the band Van Halen. They do a joke about the band Van Halen. Of course, the band Van Halen is really famous for their song called Eruption, right? And Eddie Van Halen died on October 6th, which on the Roman calendar is also 8/6, right? Think about how this episode came out on August 6th, 8/6. A whole bunch of stuff. It ties into the volcano symbolism, though, with South Park and how it relates to Tisha B'Av. And it's funny that this episode's all about ice, too, because if you go back to 2021, when I was talking about how my son Alistair had woke up in the middle of the night when he was a baby, and I randomly turned on a Netflix movie that I saw called Eurovision Song Contest with Will Ferrell, and he opens it up singing a song called Volcano Man, and he's from Iceland. Then the very next day, the main story in the news was that there was a big volcano eruption in Iceland, right? And that was because my son had woke up. And my son's birthday is August 31st, which just so happens to be 324 days before Zachary K. Hubbard's birthday, which makes me think of this volcano narrative once again and how he's related to 324. But, just thinking about ice in Iceland, right? That's what I was pointing out in this blog post. Ice in Iceland, it made me think of the volcano narrative. And that narrative, considering it was Will Ferrell, a few days later, the guy who played Will Ferrell's son in the movie Talladega Nights, it was the actor Houston Tumlin, that guy died. So a kid from Talladega Nights died just after I had that synchronicity with Iceland and volcanoes involving Will Ferrell. And Talladega, at the race in Talladega, whoever wins gets a trophy that has the god Vulcan on it, and Vulcan just so happens to be the god of volcanoes. My son, Alistair, he was born just after Tisha B'Av in 2019. He was born on August 31st. And all year in 2019, I was following this narrative with France and how it tied into NASCAR and this connection to Dale Earnhardt Jr., who was going to be racing on August 31st. And I thought possibly a racer would die on August 31st. And then, lo and behold, Dale Earnhardt Jr. just so happened to be in a plane crash on August 15th that year, which just so happens to be the birthday of Napoleon, right? Think about Napoleon in France, right? So Dale Earnhardt crashes in a plane on Napoleon's birthday. Then on August 31st that year, the day my son was born, a racer named Antoine Hubert, who was from France, ended up dying in a race. So my son's birth was even connected to NASCAR. Then a couple years later, I had that synchronicity with, him and volcano stuff. And then the kid from Talladega Nights died. So you knew there was something important to like how it related to NASCAR. And before I even watched this episode of South Park, I even made this blog post where I was talking about this same connection, right? Let's see here. Just wanted to point it out really quick. Talk about all the stuff with my son and NASCAR and how it related to the volcano symbolism. I also talked about East Coast earthquakes and how it was related to Happy Gilmore and Hulk Hogan. And we had that New Jersey earthquake on Tisha B'Av this year. Then we had another one on like August 5th in New Jersey. And think about how I was talking about the New Jersey drones and how on August 2nd, I ended up going to my brother's house and we took the way where I saw a UFO the night before 9/11/2001. And just wanted to point out, I'm talking about NASCAR and volcano symbolism. Then I end up watching this episode of South Park and I see this connection to the volcano stuff. And there's also a headline story in the news that day about the NASCAR racer Kyle Larson saying that Talladega Nights, the movie, made NASCAR look like a joke. So, of course, I was like, there must be some link with South Park in relation to volcanoes. And I looked up South Park and I noticed that the second episode of South Park just so happens to be called Volcano. Season 1, Episode 2. It was called Volcano. So then I went and watched this episode. If I could find it here. I went and watched that second episode of South Park. And at the very end of the episode, a volcano erupts, and it just so happens to go through Denver, right? And once again, think about how the Denver Broncos are related to that horse narrative that is somehow related to the volcano stuff. Another thing in this second episode of South Park called Volcano, one of the big jokes at the end is that there's this like monster named Scuzzlebutt. And he has a leg that's made up of the actor Patrick Duffy, right? His leg is the actor Patrick Duffy. And I didn't think that much of it, but I knew I had a blog post, or at least one, about Patrick Duffy. And when I looked up Patrick Duffy on my blog, the blog posts that come up have to do with Kyle Larson and a weird synchronicity with the actor Patrick Duffy. It's like, what are the odds of that? I'm talking about Kyle Larson and Patrick Duffy. And I'm also talking about Kyle Larson and Patrick Duffy and volcano symbolism. And it has absolutely nothing to do with this episode of South Park that I didn't even know about that involved Patrick Duffy. It's like, what are the odds of that? So the second episode of South Park has a joke about Patrick Duffy. And then when I type in Patrick Duffy on my blog, a bunch of the blog posts with Patrick Duffy involve Kyle Larson, who just was in the news the same day as that South Park episode with Kristi Noem, and Charlie Kirk. And my old posts have to do with volcano symbolism and the connection to Patrick Duffy and Kyle Larson. Like, what are the odds of that? So then we got the death of Charlie Kirk, right? That episode also made fun of Charlie Kirk. Notice how the word volcano equals 35. I'll just point it out really quick. Charlie Kirk then ends up dying 35 days later, right? He dies 35 days after this episode of South Park that involved him that I'm saying is connected to volcano symbolism. And then Charlie Kirk also died a span of 35 days before his own birthday. So to me, that means volcano. Not Catholic or anything else. It means volcano. Although I guess you could maybe include Catholic, considering the father symbolism and how it relates to priests and such, but it's just interesting how Charlie Kirk would go on to die 35 days later. Further, if you followed some of my stuff for a long time here for the last year or so, a big number with the father symbolism is the number 184. And if you write out Patrick Duffy, he just so happens to equal 184. And if you write out Kyle Larson, it also just so happens to equal 184. So I think it is connected to the father symbolism somehow. One thing that makes me think of Tisha B'Av with this thing is that, like, the number 184, that's the 141st composite number. And 141 is interesting because the 141st prime number is August, or 8/11, reminding us of August 11th, right? And then once again, think about that connection to August 11th and how Zach's sister's father died on that day. So there is a weird relationship here. And I know that I'm supposed to pay attention to these composite numbers. Even weirder with the father symbolism is that on August 4th, I had this dream that my father died. And I've had a few of these dreams, but this one seemed to be the most revealing. I was like at my parents' house, and my mom was crying in the bathroom, and I saw the obituary that said September 18th. And so, it like legit had a specific date in there. And nothing that big really happened on September 18th as far as I can remember. But, there was a few like odd synchronicities that day, but nothing in relation to this theme. But the reason I thought that dream was interesting was that it just so happened to be 3 months and 24 days after my father's birthday. So I had a dream about my father dying 3 months, 24 days after my father's birthday. And it showed me the date September 18th in this dream. So I was like, that's an interesting day. It's an interesting day with JFK as well and some other things. But that day just so happened to be 418 days before my next birthday as well. Think about that with the composite numbers. And I started wondering if it was in connection to the priest symbolism. And for years I've talked about this priest who got kicked out of the church for molesting, and he did a bunch of weird stuff to me as a kid, and his name was Father Howard. I don't know if he ever really molested me or whatever, but like I said, I had to go to a private meeting at his house, and all the other kids say they didn't have to do that and such. And we've always had this joke that he molested me, and none of the parents ever took it serious. And then when he got kicked out of the church in 2015, everyone was like, holy crap, you were telling the truth, But moral of the story, I noticed that September 18th to his birthday is 8 months, 7 days. And that dream was also 8 months, 7 days before my father's birthday. And back in 2017, I had this crazy synchronicity with South Park and priests and how it had to do with the number 87. And the word priest even equals 87. And the priest who supposedly molested me, his name equals 87, Howard Fitzgerald. And what that day, I was a couple weeks before that day or whatever, back in 2017, I was at like a campfire, and my friend told me that there's this movie called Spotlight with Michael Keaton in it. And that movie is about the 87 priests who molest kids in Boston. But anyway, he told me that Father Howard's name was listed at the end of the movie, which it isn't. But I was getting ready to watch that movie one night, and I had it loaded up on my computer, and then my daughter was trying to go to bed, and she wanted me to turn the channel to cartoons or whatever, and I saw South Park was on, and I was just joking, and I turned it to South Park, and it just so happened to be the 87th episode called Red Hot Catholic Love that equals 87 about Catholic priests molesting kids. And I thought, what are the odds that I would randomly turn this episode on as a joke? It's the 87th episode, it equals 87, it's about Catholic priests molesting kids. Then later I watched the movie called Spotlight, and I see that it's about the 87 priests who molest kids in Boston. Then I see the word priest equals 87. Then I see Father Howard's real name equals 87. And I'm just like, that is some crazy stuff. And I started making a blog post, And exactly 87 minutes after I started that blog post, my friend Pam called me at like 2 something in the morning, and her name equals 87. And it was like, what are the odds of all this, you know? So it all had to do with the number 87. So I thought September 18th was interesting because it was 8 months, 7 days before Father Howard's birthday. And that dream was 8 months, 7 days before my father's birthday. So I started thinking that this father symbolism, it has to do with priests. There's something important to priests. And further, the town Earling, Iowa, where the movie The Ritual is based off of, that I'm talking about with the volcano symbolism and the father symbolism, Father Howard, after he left the town that I'm in, he was the priest in Earling, Iowa for some time. And remember, a different priest from the 90s died, that was the priest in Earling, Iowa. He died on my father's birthday this year, just before the movie The Ritual was released. And another interesting thing is when I first started following this narrative with the Jesuits and the father symbolism in 2017, it all had to do with the death of my Uncle Barney in 2017, that once again still makes no sense, is even linked up to Cooper DeJean and a bunch of stuff this year, but my Uncle Barney's birthday was Neptune-Earling, July 23rd. So we will see, because, that obituary in my dream didn't show a year, but it did show me the date, September 18th, so maybe it's for a whole different year. Maybe it'll be 10 years down the road and there'll be something connected on that date to this symbolism, because I know that's how this stuff happens. Sometimes you think that it's for this specific time period, and maybe nobody will even die on that day. Maybe there'll be something connected. Maybe there will be a death, but it will be connected to that day through this symbolism, because I know that's how it works a lot of times. Or maybe Father Howard will die on that day, like in 10 years or something. You know what I'm saying? It's just, we'll find out. I also pointed out in this blog post about Trevor Bauer's finger. And if you remember in 2016, right before the World Series, Trevor Bauer injured his finger because it got cut with a drone. And YouTube had took a picture of Father Howard from one of my old videos, and they used that as the thumbnail of my Trevor Bauer finger video. And they did it all by the numbers, and it was connected to the father symbolism. And, I blogged about it in here and such, but it made me think of this because a kid from this area was out working in the fields or whatever, and a drone injured his fingers just recently. And at first they said he lost both his hands and whatever, and he ended up just, he didn't, I don't even think he lost his fingers, but that was the big story going around, that this kid got injured. He injured his hand by a drone. And I also thought this was interesting because my cousin Craig's daughter recently rolled, it was on the 4th of July or around the 4th of July, rolled side by side, and she ended up losing 4 of her fingers. So I was pointing this out in relation to the father symbolism. It made me think, this kid getting injured by the drone, it made me think of Trevor Bauer and how that was linked up to the Indians being in the World Series, and it was also linked up to this father symbolism. And then a few days later, we got this story about a fire that broke out on Arthur's Seat, which is a famous volcano, right? I'm so a fire on a volcano now, just after I'm talking about all this volcano symbolism. And I was talking about how this volcano had a lot to do with the number 292. Arthur's Seat equals 292. And when I searched my blog for the number 292, a whole bunch of stuff about Freddy Krueger came up, right? And Freddy Krueger's interesting because he's played by Robert Englund, but Freddy Krueger equals 292. But think about Freddy Krueger in relation to the dream theme, right? I was pointing out how Robert Englund's birthday is 6/6, which is D-Day, right? The big day with the volcano and horse symbolism. Further, if you look at Arthur's Seat, it talks about how it's one of the places that is believed to be where Camelot was. Camelot and King Arthur. And if you go back to 2015, there was this big Freddie and Gray narrative that had to do with Freddie Gray, and it had to do with Kanye West singing Bohemian Rhapsody and Glastonbury And Glastonbury had this link to King Arthur. And, there was this big Freddy theme. And then I talked about how it was connected to the VMAs that year. Then Wes Craven, the guy who made the Freddy Krueger movies, died on the same day as the VMAs. And a bunch of stuff. This big Freddy narrative. And I thought that was interesting because they're saying Arthur's seat has this connection to King Arthur, which goes back to the Kanye West narrative that actually involves fingers because my Uncle Freddie lost a bunch of his fingers when he was younger, and we call him Freddy Fingers or Freddy Fingers. And this volcano, or this fire on this volcano, just so happened to be on August 10th, which just so happened to be my Uncle Freddie's birthday. So I thought there was this relationship when I saw the 292 and how it was connected to this old Freddy theme that had to do with fingers. And I have a playlist of this stuff on YouTube, and randomly, back when I was making them videos about the Earling, Iowa exorcism and the movie called The Ritual coming out, if you go back and watch them videos, at the end of one of them, I'm talking about how this video was Zach Hubbard and the finger looking like Dr. Evil from Austin Powers just randomly got put in this playlist. And I never put this video in that playlist, right? But notice how the finger is important in this thumbnail. And also, Dr. Evil used to live in a volcano, right? He has a volcano lair. So there's something weird with the volcano symbolism with this. Of course, Zach also used to be from Seattle, right? And he lived in Washington, and he lives in Washington. And think about that in relation to volcanoes and Mount Rainier and Mount St. Helens and such like that. And what's interesting about that, too, is that on August 6th, that gas station that burnt down right next to where I work, the girl who owns that, I dated her for a very short amount of time back in the early 2000s or whatever. And I ended up going on a vacation to my uncle's house in Seattle, or Renton, or whatever town it was, one of them towns, a suburb of Seattle. But when we got there, we ended up meeting up with this girl's uncle. And he took us up to Mount Rainier and such. And it was weird because I didn't even know that was her uncle and whatever else. And it was just a random thing. Like, we ran into this guy randomly. Like, I leave from Iowa, go to Seattle, and we run into some guy who was the uncle of the girl I was dating. It's like, and then he took us to Mount Rainier. And it's like, then on August 6th, the big day I'm following with this symbolism, that girl's, the business that she owns burns down. So once again, I mean, it is so complex, but if you're just paying attention, there are signs everywhere. There is something that wants me to see this volcano symbolism and how it relates to all of these other things. My uncle's name even equals 292, like Arthur's seat equals 292, like Freddy Krueger equals 292, I also pointed out how my cousin's daughter who lost her fingers, her name equals 324. And then I went on to talk about how Gabriel also sums the 324. And Gabriel is the angel who, is associated with dreams. And if you go back to 2024, right before I won $10,000, and I had that dream about getting all number 9s on a slot machine, and then I won $10,000 9 days later on that slot machine, and I had a bunch of synchronicity with the angel Gabriel, and it had to do with the number 9 and such, and it all had to do with dreams. It's interesting that Gabriel also sums to 324. And Gabriel was important to the father symbolism too, right? Because he told Mary that she was going to be the birth Jesus, and she told Zachariah he was going to birth, or his wife was going to birth John the Baptist on the date. And they celebrate that on 6/24, which is this other big date I follow with the father symbolism for years. And it has to do with Trevor Bauer and the father symbolism and the finger stuff. Too much to be explained, but I'm pointing out this connection to Gabriel, right? And, then a few weeks later, we get the Annunciation Catholic school shooting. And of course, the Annunciation is when Gabriel told Mary that she was going to birth Jesus Christ. Of course, this also happened during the astrological sign of Virgo, and Virgo is for virgin, right? And think about Mary, the virgin, And Mary, supposedly, they celebrate her birthday on September 8th, which just so happens to be the birthday of Zachary K. Hubbard's mother. And, this shooting was supposedly on 54th Street. If you write out Annunciation, it equals 54. If you write out Gabriel, it equals 54. The person who shot the school was Robin Westman, that equals 54. And also 918. And then think about that dream that I had about the date 918 and the father symbolism. And if you go back to 2017, around the time that my Uncle Barney had died in January of 2017, that's when I started following this narrative associated with the angel Gabriel. And I had a whole bunch of different things, and it was all connected to the Super Bowl and whatever else. I'm not going to re-explain it all, but just remember a big thing had to do with the angel Gabriel. And that's when I pointed out that, he only comes to Daniel, Zechariah, and Mary in the Bible. And then, of course, my name was Daniel. You had Zach Hubbard. And, a whole bunch of other stuff. This lady named Mary Toffelmeyer called into the radio show and said that the Umbrella Man was trying to hurt her pet pigs. And I was sitting next to 2 stuffed animal pigs that my daughter called her pets that night before she went to bed. And I was watching for, a lady named Mary and a whole bunch of stuff. And then this lady named Mary calls in and talks, and I have synchronicity with her calling into this radio show. It's unbelievable. Then my girlfriend got pregnant again and whatever else. We ended up having a kid, Zamian, on January 17th of 2018, the very next year. But the point I wanted to make was that just that Gabriel equaled 324, this big number that just keeps showing up within everything that I am talking about. Let's see here. I'm just going to backtrack a little bit, but on, I think it was August 11th, right? It was, August 11th. I had a bunch of free play, so I was like, I'm going to go to the casino and play the pig machine because August 11th, 2019 had a lot to do with the Chinese pig year. Ended up losing, whatever, no big deal. But on the way home, you drive through Soldier, Iowa, and I started thinking about this kid that I went to high school with named Kyle Allen, who cut off his ring finger in Woods class in high school or whatever, and he lived in Soldier. And I was just randomly thinking about him, never typed anything in. And just after I was thinking about it, I got a notification on my phone from Kyle Allen Music, and I was like, that's the kid who cut his finger off. That's from Soldier, Iowa. What are the odds of that? But what was interesting, not only was I just thinking about that, I get a notification for some random YouTube that I'm not even subscribed to. And, just by thinking about it, and it's not even the same guy. But the post right below it just so happened to be RPM Trey. And he's holding up his fingers, and it looks like he's missing his ring finger, right? He's doing the shocker. And it's like, what are the odds of that? Right below the Kyle Allen post is a picture where a guy looks just like Kyle Allen's hand. Once again, that connection to the finger symbolism. And then my brother, I don't know what it was, a few days later, my brother sends me this thing of this t-shirt that he said he's going to buy me. Just randomly. I barely ever talk to my brother. But it's a priest and a boy, and it says, love is love. And I'm like, dude, haven't talked to my brother about any of this, ever. I don't even see my brother. And he randomly sends me this shirt that he says he bought me. Then I went to YouTube, and there was some father-son slot live notification. Then I started just thinking about how 2017 was the year that I started following the Gabriel stuff and the father symbolism. And that's the year that the guy on the Price is Right reached out to me. The guy with the perfect showcase named Terry Neese, whose niece would later go on to be on the show. And she also got called up on stage, and she sat in the same seat as him and such. But remember, he reached out to me the day before the Las Vegas attack that's related to the Manchester Arena, or the Midtown Manhattan attack. But I noticed that guy reached out to me 324 days after my birthday, 324. And remember that guy, Terry Neese, his name just so happens to equal 324 as well. His name equals 324. He reached out to me 324 days after my birthday. He reached out to me 134 days after his birthday. Notice his name also equals 134. And his book that is about his experience on The Price is Right Just so happens to be 134 pages long. So I was like, what in the world is going on here? This number 324. And once again, this number, the word Gabriel also equals 324. And it had to do with the dream stuff that came from 2017. And remember, right after my son was born, I was talking about how I thought it was important to bridge symbolism. And then on March 6th, I had a dream that my father died in 2018. March 6th. And then 9 days later, we had the FIU bridge collapse. And that's why in 2024, when I had that dream about winning $10,000 or about all the number nines, and then I won $10,000 and such, and it all had to do with Gabriel. That's why it was interesting, because of this dream I had in 2018, 9 days before the FIU bridge collapse, and it was about my father dying. And my Uncle Clancy was in that dream as well, and he was alive, but my Uncle Clancy then would go on to die like a month after that dream. But I'm bringing this up because I realized that that original dream that I'm talking about that's connected to Gabriel was 3 months and 24 days after my birthday. So there's no doubt this number 324, it has to do with father symbolism. And then to get the Annunciation High School shooting, and the person who shot it up equals 54 and 918. And I had that dream showing me the date 918, 3 months, 24 days after my father's birthday. And that shooting was in Minneapolis, right? And remember in 2018, just before I had that original dream about my father dying, it was after Super Bowl 52, and the Super Bowl was held in US Bank Stadium in Minneapolis. So then after I noticed all this, the very next day, I had to go to a wedding rehearsal because I was DJing, and they wanted me to actually DJ for the ceremony as well. So I went to the Methodist church, and I had to stand up on the whatever it is, what is it called? The stage or whatever, the altar. I don't know. But I had to stand like on the other side of the pastor, right? And then I played the music as they were walking in and such. But I went to their rehearsal, and they decided that they were going to go to Earling to eat for that rehearsal, and they invited me to come along and such. I just thought it was interesting that I was going to Earling that night. I barely ever go to this town anymore. And the pastor went on to tell me how he used to work with my dad for like a bunch of years until my dad retired and such. So I was like, wow, that's so weird. You know, that he worked with my dad for all these years, and he knows my dad real well. And I had no idea that even they worked with him. And then we go to Earling, of all places. Then, shortly after this, there's a story going around on Facebook about this Earling man who was sentenced for embezzling Pokemon cards. It's like, dude, what is going on in this town? Like I'm saying, it's not even 400 people. And, you know, there's a kid who lives there who gets in a wreck connected to the Cheers owner who, you know, gets sexual assault. Then there's a murder in the town. They release a mainstream movie called The Ritual that has to do with the exorcism in the town. And now there's a story of some man who was embezzling Pokemon cards. And of course, in the composite ciphers, if you write out Pokemon cards, his name equals Pokemon cards equals 231. And then in the reverse composite cipher, the guy who was embezzling, his name equals 231. You know what I'm saying? Like, what are the odds of that? Pokemon, he equals the same as Pokemon cards in the composite ciphers. Then I was at work. Oh, it was the next day, I'm pretty sure, at work. And up by where we have the phone, I noticed there was a random Pokemon card sitting like right by where the phone is or whatever. There's a Pokemon card right here. And I'm like, what are the odds I'm reading this story about the guy embezzling Pokemon cards? And then there's a Pokemon card just chilling by the phone at work the next day. Or actually, as I'm looking at my post again, I saw this card the day before, and I didn't think much of it. And then I saw the story about the Pokemon cards when I got home. And then the next day I went back, and this card was still sitting there. And then I looked at it, and it was this card called Crispin. I know nothing about Pokemon cards or Pokemon at all, but I noticed if you write out Crispin, it equals 114, just like The Ritual. I learned about the film The Ritual on Facebook from a girl whose name sums to 114. The trailer that she had, or I clicked on, was 1 minute 14 seconds. If you're at Earling, Iowa, it equals 114. And when I looked more into Crispin of Pokemon, it said that he was a specialty. His specialty is fire, so he's a fire Pokemon. Once again, think about Vulcan and volcanoes. Thought about Crispin Glover as well. He's the father on Back to the Future. Just an, only Crispin that I can think of. Crispin Glover. And his name equaled 184, like that father theme number. Michael J. Fox is also in Teen Wolf, and Teen Wolf came out on Vulcanalia. Crispin Glover is also the bad guy on the movie Like Mike, where little Bow Wow gets the magic shoes and he can play like Michael Jordan. And it was just interesting because my kids had just got new shoes for school. And my son Alistair was telling me how he can play basketball like Michael Jordan now because he got these new shoes or whatever. And he's never seen that movie, but there was some game that he was playing that had magic shoes where he could play like Michael Jordan. There had to be a play on that movie or something. But I mean, yeah, I'm talking about the or the volcano stuff again. And so on, just pointing out all these weird things. What is the infatuation with Earling, Iowa, and the news? Just the smallest town of the world. Then one day a couple days later, I came home from work, and I noticed that my son had a book of Pokemon cards. I never knew my kid even had Pokemon cards, but he had them sitting like on the stairs, like on the landing. And I was like, what in the world? There's Pokemon cards? And then there was a couple Pokemon cards laying on the floor. I don't know, it's just weird that Zamian had Pokemon cards. I didn't even know he had Pokemon cards. And, I discovered this 7 months and 2 days after his birthday, and his name equals 72 frontwards and backwards. And when he was born, it was all about the number 72. And when my son Alistair was born, it was all about the number 72. Just so many things going on too. YouTube removed one of my old music videos about this stupid song I wrote about eating mushrooms and meeting the Tootsie Roll owl, right? The song called Free. YouTube removed it, and I mean, it's been on there for 15 years or something, and then they just randomly removed this video on August 20th, this day I was watching for volcano symbolism with South Park, but they removed this, and then at work, Heather is eating these candies that look like mushrooms. She offers me some, and I'm like, YouTube just takes down my video, and then you're eating these candies. You offer me some that look like mushrooms, and I pointed out the connection with the numbers to the volcano symbolism, and the part where they removed it was because I said the word PCP, that equals 35, like volcano. All I did was show like a baggie with the words PCP in it. It was just a piece of paper. And they said that was bad or something, but the guy who voiced the Tootsie Roll owl, he died in connection to the same numbers, and it was also connected to the father symbolism. And then I kept getting spammed on this old post I had about some lady winning the Powerball, right? I mean, I had all kinds of these just people spamming this post for days, and I was like, I couldn't figure out what the point is. I'm still getting spammed on it now all of a sudden, and I still don't get it, but it was about this lady Mavis Wanzak, or however you say that, winning the Powerball. And a lady with that name really did win the Powerball a few years back. But the blog post that I made about her was on August 24th. And it never dawned on me, but on August 24th this year, I hit $9,000 on a slot machine, and it was called Pompeii. Like, it was a volcano slot machine. So, like, after Tisha B'Av and all that, I keep getting spammed on this post that I posted on August 24th from years back about a lady winning the Powerball, and then I end up winning a big jackpot on a volcano machine on that day. It's just the weirdest. And it was $9,000, right? Think about Angel Gabriel and the number 9. And I mean, I don't know what the full significance is, but this lady was from like Chicopee, Massachusetts, I know I posted about it on here somewhere. She's from Chicopee, Massachusetts. And after I realized this, I was at work and I needed to get like a new dish towel. And I reached up and I noticed that the box said Chicopee on it. So it's just like, who knows? You know what I mean? I had a bunch of other synchronicity on this same day with my friend Derek, and his birthday was Tisha B'Av. And there was all kinds of stuff that had to do with Revelation. So maybe that white horse symbolism does have to do with Revelation. But I'm going to skip over that. But the website that I won on is called McLuck. And if you write out the website, it just so happens to equal 324. And even weirder, if you go back to April, when I was talking about that movie, The Ritual, with Earling, Iowa, I also talked about volcano synchronicity with this guy on YouTube and how he was talking about something about how he thinks there's going to be a big volcano eruption. He's from Earling, Iowa. And in this blog post, I also mentioned how I started getting a bunch of spammed comments on that old Mavis Wanzak Powerball post, right? So when I first started talking about the Ritual movie and the volcano symbolism in Earling, Iowa, I started getting spammed on this old post. And then in August, I started getting spammed all over it again. And then I ended up winning money on the day that I made the blog post about this, August 24th. And it was on a volcano slot machine. And you know this guy from Earling or whatever that has a channel? He's always talking about when he was younger, he was in like he grew up in like these satanic cult things in Omaha. And, you know, he's talking about the pedophilia and such. And it's just interesting. Like, why would you move to Earling, Iowa? Like, where there was the famous exorcism, and then they make a movie about it. It just always blew my mind. I wonder if he even knew about this exorcism or whatever when he moved there, or I don't know. It's just, there's something weird about it all. I don't know how to explain it, you know? But, you know, the fact that he's talking about growing up in these people doing satanic rituals in Omaha and stuff, and then he moves to Earling where there's the famous exorcism. And the priest from that town who died on my father's birthday, Father Burner, he just so happened to be, he won Publishers Clearinghouse when he was the priest in Earling, Iowa, right? So he won a bunch of money from Publishers Clearinghouse while he was the priest, and that was a big old thing I talked about in my old videos about it, about that movie and such. But it's like, isn't that weird, you know? A priest wins Publishers Clearinghouse of all people. And in the same video that I have on the screen here, he's talking about how he played the Book of Daniel twice in a row, and he had this journey dream. And it's just funny because, you know, like I said, the Book of Daniel involves Daniel meeting Gabriel, right? And Gabriel helps Daniel with his visions and dreams, something I talked about clear back in 2017 because I kept having synchronicity with the angel Gabriel, and my name was Daniel, and it was synced up to Dan Marino. So then it's interesting that I start getting spammed on that post again. I win a bunch of money. Then we get the Annunciation shooting in Minneapolis that's obviously linked up to the angel Gabriel. Then we get the Minnesota Vikings who open up their season on the Virgin Mary's birthday, and they play the Chicago Bears, and they do a tribute to the 1985 Bears, which is interesting to Super Bowl 50 because Super Bowl 50 was all about the 1985 Bears. The coach of the Carolina Panthers, Ron Rivera, was a member of the 1985 Bears. The Panthers season, where they lost one game, was compared to the 1985 Bears. The Bears won Super Bowl XX, right, in 1985. Remember how Beyonce wore the X on her outfit at Super Bowl 50? At Super Bowl XX, the Bears won with 46 points, and they were using their, at the time, revolutionary 4-6 defense. And I know I put this in here. They beat the Patriots, with the S exception. Patriots even equal 46. Chicago equals 46. Super Bowl 50 was the 46th Super Bowl of the modern era. So it was Super Bowl 50 but it was only the 46th Super Bowl of the modern era. And it was played in Levi's Stadium, that equals 46. The Denver Broncos won Super Bowl 50, and they won that 46 days before Peyton Manning's birthday on 3/24. And the Broncos originally played in Bears Stadium, right? Or Bear Stadium. And the only time that Peyton Manning won a Super Bowl before Super Bowl 50, he beat the Chicago Bears, and that's when he played for the Colts. The Colts are also another team that has the horse logo. And then Peyton Manning also wore the number 18 for the Broncos. If you add out Bears, it equals 18. The Bears quarterback right now is number 18, and in that game against the Vikings on the day they opened up the season on the Virgin Mary's birthday, he got his first rushing touchdown in his 18th game, and he's also born on the 18th of November. If you write out the word 18, it equals 46. And in relation to Happy Gilmore coming out and all the connections I've talked about with Happy Gilmore to Tisha B'Av and such, it's interesting that Happy Gilmore wears the Boston Bruins number 18 jersey. And remember what was his name? Daniel Haggerty or something? It was some Haggerty guy who was known for playing Grizzly Adams. He died just before Super Bowl 50, right? And think about how in Happy Gilmore they say, Grizzly Adams did have a beard, right? And then Grizzly Adams died right before Super Bowl 50. And, there's a whole bunch more with this, but, Happy Gilmore wears the number 18. And a Bruin is also a bear. There was also that movie called The Revenant that came out just before Super Bowl 50. And that movie was all about a bear, right? And ESPN did a 30 for 30 on the 1985 Bears just before Super Bowl 50. I mean, it was super synced up to Super Bowl XX, where the Bears won. But then you swing it to the father symbolism and think how the new Pope just so happens to be from Chicago, right? Pope Leo from Chicago. Leo's during the time of Neptune-Earling. But then we got the really, really big story of the death of Charlie Kirk. And Charlie Kirk also was a fan of the Chicago Cubs. But instantly when I thought of the death of Charlie Kirk, and I saw that there was another story of a school shooting in Denver, I couldn't help but think of the connection to South Park, right? Think about how South Park is set in Colorado, and South Park had just made fun of Charlie Kirk on an episode. And I was talking all about the volcano symbolism that had to do with that episode. And then Charlie Kirk dies 35 days later, and the word volcano equals 35. Remember that the second episode of South Park, the volcano erupts and it goes through Denver. And it gets even deeper when you start looking more into it, because the Evergreen High School that supposedly got shot up the same day as Charlie Kirk, that just so happened to be where Trey Parker, one of the creators of South Park, attended high school. He went to Evergreen High School. And in my previous post where I talked about Charlie Kirk, I talked about how he died after South Park had aired 332 episodes, and Charlie Kirk ended up dying a span of 332 days after his own birthday. Also, that episode was called Walk is Dead, which is a play on the woke movement. And think about how Charlie Kirk would go to campuses and challenge the woke kids, right? And it's called Woke is Dead, right? So then Charlie Kirk ends up getting shot at the campus 332 days after his birthday, after South Park aired 332 episodes. If you write out Trey Parker in Gematria and the capital letter ciphers, his name equals 264. And that's interesting because the 264th composite number is 332. And there were some other connections, such as how South Park equals 39, and Charlie Kirk and the Evergreen shooting supposedly happened 39 days before Trey Parker's birthday. But I went and looked up Matt Stone, the other creator of South Park, and Charlie Kirk just happened to die 3 months and 16 days after his birthday. And remember, 316 and 418 were these big numbers that had to do with the Donald Trump assassination attempt. And they were important to the composite numbers and composite ciphers, right? So interesting, he died, 316 after Matt Stone's birthday. And Bobby Simpson had pointed out to me that Charlie Kirk had died 424 days after the first Donald Trump assassination attempt as well. And remember, 424 is that big number with Donald Trump, right? And touching the Western Wall at 424. A whole bunch of things that are connected to this. And Matt Stone and Trey Parker's birthdays are even 4 months and 24 days apart. So there is a definite narrative that goes back to that same thing with Donald Trump and so on. And, there's some other things too. Like, there's a bunch of stuff with the Mormons, right? And I'll come back to this with South Park, but the South Park has, a big importance to the Mormons. Think about how Charlie Kirk was supposedly assassinated in Utah. That's all about the Mormons. But I knew that I had blogged about the number 332 at some point halfway recent. So I searched on my blog for the number 332, and it was interesting because it said Buffalo Bills equal 332 and the reverse composite cipher. And, just think about how the Buffalo Bills are interrelated with the Denver Broncos due to the O.J. Simpson connection. And of course, Damar Hamlin, who shares a birthday with Peyton Manning, and Damar Hamlin collapsing for the Buffalo Bills, which had a lot to do with genuflecting and the number 33 and Freemasonry. But maybe I'll talk about that in a minute. But when I looked up this Evergreen High School, it also said that it was on Buffalo Park Road. So I thought that was interesting. Buffalo Park Road. And then Buffalo Bills equal 332. And as I looked further into the number 332 on my blog, I also had a synchronicity on December 23rd of 2024, and it was a synchronicity with this other old blog post I had from 2017 that had to do with watching The Simpsons, and The Simpsons, on the episode of The Simpsons, Bart and Milhouse were watching the 43rd episode of South Park, and then Marge changed the channel to PAX TV, and it was some show about the everyday life of angels. So last December, I had synchronicity with this old blog post I had about PAX TV and The Simpsons, and I thought that was interesting when I was looking at this stuff because Netflix had recently told me to watch this movie K-Pax with Kevin Spacey. Never even heard of it. Don't know why. I just randomly clicked on the movie and started watching it, and it's like this strange movie where he's kind of like he's an alien from the planet K-Pax, or that's what you think. It's kind of a confusing movie, but the whole point is the whole time that I was watching this movie, I was thinking about that this old blog post about PAX TV might be important. PAX TV, K-Pax, and when I was this old blog post had a bunch of number 332 in it right here, and what's interesting is just days after making this blog post last December, I also had a blog post about a synchronicity with Kevin Spacey, and I never even put it together that it had any connection to this movie, K-Pax, because I'd never even heard of this movie, let alone knew that Kevin Spacey was in it. But Kevin Spacey just so happens to equal 332. And what's even more interesting is just yesterday, on the 324th day of the year, I started seeing this story about Kevin Spacey saying that he is homeless. It's all over. It was all over the news. Maybe the story came out before yesterday, but yesterday, the 324th day of the year, was the day that I first seen this story about Kevin Spacey saying that he's homeless, right? So a ton of these news articles were all from yesterday on the 324th day of the year. So it's just interesting. There is some weird relationship here that's going on with these numbers. But anyway, so when I had realized this connection and I had this synchronicity watching K-Pax, and I have an old blog post from last December where I talked about a synchronicity with PAX TV and The Simpsons, I went back and looked at that episode of The Simpsons where they have the PAX TV, and like I said, Bart and Milhouse are watching the 43rd episode of South Park, and then Marge changed the channel to PAX TV, and it was Everyday Life of Angels. And back then, in 2017, I pointed out how PAX TV equals 312. And it's interesting if you write out K Pax and equals 312. And they make sure to tell us it was the 43rd episode of South Park on The Simpsons. And when you look up the 43rd episode of South Park, it's season 3, episode 12, like 312. But what's interesting about that, on The Simpsons, the episode that they're talking about with South Park, it has this robot, and he says, "Look who's in my farts, OJ." And then OJ Simpson comes out and starts stabbing him or whatever. So OJ Simpson is even involved in this episode of The Simpsons where they're talking about the 43rd episode of South Park, and then Marge changes the channel to PAX TV. So, once again, the Broncos and OJ Simpson. OJ Simpson also related to, the Buffalo Bills. OJ Simpson got away in the white Bronco, right? There's an interrelated relationship here. And of course, when I was making this blog post, I had stopped to see what time it was to go get my kids from school, and I noticed it was 3:32. But I also pointed out there's an episode of South Park called Go Fund Yourself, and it's where the kids start a GoFundMe, and they change their name to Washington Redskins, and the Redskins go all crazy and want their name back or whatever. And, just think about that with Donald Trump recently saying that he won't approve the new stadium for the Washington Commanders if they don't change their name back to Redskins. And Donald Trump once tried to buy the Buffalo Bills. And in this episode, the only NFL owner that's missing is the owner of the Buffalo Bills, because that guy had recently died, so he wasn't there. But another thing that's interesting in this episode was that they have Kirk-Cousins in the episode. Originally, this was supposed to be RG3, but he got injured, so South Park hurried up and updated it, and they put Kirk-Cousins in there instead. Just think about Charlie Kirk-Cousins. I also saw a blog post that Zach had made where he pointed out Teddy Roosevelt, the guy who replaced William McKinley, who got assassinated in Buffalo. But Teddy Roosevelt survived an assassination attempt on Charlie Kirk's birthday in Milwaukee, and that stood out because J.D. Vance was announced as the vice president candidate for Donald Trump in Milwaukee, and he was the youngest vice president nominee since Teddy Roosevelt. And he was also announced just after the assassination attempt of Donald Trump. And then Charlie Kirk spoke at a convention in Milwaukee, and Trump also honored a Buffalo firefighter who died at his assassination attempt that day, right? So the first Donald Trump assassination attempt, the guy who died was the Buffalo firefighter. So there is an interrelated relationship to how the Buffalo Bills and the Denver Broncos are related. And, it goes back to O.J. Simpson. And sorry, I had to go back and reread what I wrote here because I got a little caught up here, but Charlie Kirk spoke at that convention in Milwaukee where Donald Trump honored the Buffalo firefighter who died at his assassination attempt. It wasn't a separate one. Charlie Kirk actually spoke at that same convention. That's why it was important. But as I move along here, I started noticing a whole bunch of other things with 324, such as how Charlie Kirk's wife started getting big in the news. And if you look up Charlie Kirk's wife, her birthday just so happens to be November 20th, which is the 324th day of the year. Although she was born in a leap year, so technically it was the 325th, but this year she celebrated her birthday on the 324th day of the year. So she even has a connection to 324. She even went to a college that was in Denver, right? That connection back to South Park and such. And what stood out to me right away when I saw that her birthday was November 20th, my best friend's birthday is also November 20th, so he was born on the 324th day of the year. He's the one that I had the synchronicity with Damar Hamlin, and I was coming from the dollar store, and when I was looking at his post, a white Bronco that looked like OJ's came over the hill that I talked about earlier. But his birthday is the 324th day of the year. And what's interesting is that his younger brother years ago actually died in a car wreck, and his name was Kirk. And if you write out his name in gematria, it also equals 332. Of course, the car that he died in was a car that me and his brother, my best friend, we went to my first ever Michigan football game in that car, and it was a Saturn, and his brother died on 511, like how Saturn equals 511. But I'm just bringing that up because Michigan Wolverines also equal 332, so there was no doubt that I was supposed to see that in some way, you know. And my best friend was also the one who originally sent me the video of Charlie Kirk getting shot in the neck. I had no idea about it. I was at work, and he Snapchatted me, and then he said something about Charlie Kirk, and I watched the video. So he's even the one who told me about Charlie Kirk dying, and he's born on the 324th day of the year, the same day that Charlie Kirk's wife was born. And then he had a brother named Kirk who actually died. My best friend is also a humongous Cleveland Indians / Guardians fan. And that just stood out because, you know, right after this, or right around the same time, the Cleveland Indians Guardians, they went on that historic run and they ended up making the playoffs and such. And for years I've talked about, well, for one, remember 2016, I was talking about that big Native American theme all year that had to do with all these synchronicities and things going on in my life. And it even involved the football player Brandon Sheriff or Scherf or however you pronounce his name, who who grew up like 25 minutes away from where I live, but he also announced his retirement this year, right? He announced his retirement in August, just before Charlie Kirk was assassinated, and he played for the Washington Redskins. But there was this big narrative in 2016 with Native Americans. I think how Charlie Kirk's favorite team was the Chicago Cubs, and the Chicago Cubs beat the Cleveland Indians in the 2016 World Series. And remember, during that World Series, there was the Dakota Access Pipeline stuff going on in the news like crazy, bunch of Native American stuff. And back then, what I was pointing out how there was a big Native American theme connected to the area I lived that had to do with the Omaha tribe. And the town that I live in actually killed the last keeper of the sacred pole of the Omaha tribe named Chief Yellow Smoke, whose name equals 324. And that was interesting because the town that I live in killed him, and the tribe was going to kill the whole town, but then the town decided to dress up in their Freemason outfits and go outside and do hand signs or whatever, and they did them, and then the tribe that came to town to kill the whole town, they believed the Freemasons because they somehow knew Masonic signs and symbols, and they believed them that the people who killed them weren't from the town and had fled the town. So they didn't kill my whole town because the Freemasons saved the town, and the Omaha tribe knew Masonic signs and symbols, which I always thought was the strangest thing. So, you know, what are the odds that that chief, his name equals 324? And this also ties into, you know, Jim Irsay or Irsay, the Indianapolis Colts owner who died earlier this year as well, because back in 2016, he bought Prince, the singer. He bought his Yellow Cloud guitar, and I was talking about how it was connected to Chief Yellow Smoke, Yellow Cloud. And then, you know, Indiana is the land of the Indian. And of course, the Colts are another horse team, and the Colts are also the other team that's connected to John Elway and also Peyton Manning, who both have the connection to the Colts and the Broncos. And the Colts quarterback is Daniel Jones, who had formerly replaced Peyton Manning's brother Eli at New York, and now he plays for the Colts. You know what else is really weird is that Cam Scadaboo, he's really big in the Giants now, right? Where Daniel Jones used to play and so on. And it's interesting, he went to college at Sacramento State, and my cousin actually used to be one of the coaches at Sacramento State during the time that Cam Scadaboo was there. So he probably might even know him. But what's interesting is that my cousin just so happens to be a big Denver Broncos fan, you know? My cousin's a big Denver Broncos fan, and he coached at San Diego State where Cam Scadaboo was also, you know, while he was there. So He lives in like Tennessee now or something, so I don't ever really talk to him. But I'm just interested if he actually knows who he is. But he's 33 years old right now, and remember how the Broncos had that big 33-point comeback against the New York Giants this year as well. And it was all about the number 33. But it's just, once again, there's something connected to the Denver Broncos or this horse theme. It's kind of interrelated with the Colts and the Buffalo Bills. The Colts are having a really good season as well. The Broncos having a really good season. The Bills aren't having too bad of a season. There's something interesting with it all. And a big piece of it has to do with this number 324 that I just have tons of synchronicities with. Another thing about the Omaha tribe was, if you go back to 2016, a big thing that I talked about was how it was connected to the Mormons, right? The Omaha tribe is actually what brought the Mormons to Council Bluffs, Iowa, which used to be called Canesville. That's why, between Iowa and Nebraska going into Omaha, there's the Mormon Bridge, because the Omaha tribe brought the Mormons to that area, a famous stopping point on the Mormon Trail. And once again, think how South Park has that episode of South Park called All About Mormons. Let's just type it out really quick. All About Mormons. There's an episode of South Park where they make fun of the Mormons. And even when you read down in here about it, it even talks about the Utah Valley State College where Charlie Kirk was assassinated. And this was written in here years ago. Nobody changed it recently. But the episode was used as an exhibit in discussing Mormonism and popular culture by Utah Valley State College. So they even use it as an exhibit at the college where Charlie Kirk was supposedly assassinated. The creators of South Park even have the musical called The Book of Mormon, right? Book of Mormon, the musical. And look when it premiered. March 24th, 3/24, 2011, 324. So after I'm blogging about all these things with the Mormon church and so on, then the big news was this Mormon shooting, right? There was a shooting at the Mormon church, and it was just the day after the oldest ever president of the church, the Mormon church, died. So the day after the oldest president ever of the Mormon church dies, we get a shooting at a Michigan Mormon church. And would you believe the shooter's name? This guy, his name just so happened to equal 324, Thomas Sanford, 324. And would you believe that shooting just so happened to be the 324th mass shooting in the United States in 2025? 324th mass shooting by a guy whose name equals 324. After I'm talking about this big number with 324 and how it connects to Charlie Kirk and the Mormons. Even funnier is the day before this shooting, the football game was Colorado Buffaloes versus BYU, right? The Mormon school. And Colorado ended up getting fined because the fans were chanting anti-Mormon chants the day before a Mormon church, there's a Mormon church shooting. The day before, Colorado is yelling anti-Mormon chants to the BYU people. And, once again, they're the Buffaloes. The creators of South Park actually went to the University of Colorado, and that's where they met, and then later went on to make the South Park and the Mormon stuff. But once again, that connection back to Buffalo as well, because the Colorado Buffaloes. It's also interesting to note that the Colorado Buffaloes also just unveiled their new mascot, Ralphie 7, which is a buffalo. They let him run around the stadium and such. And his name's Ralphie, which is interesting because the owner that was missing in that 2014 South Park episode, Go Fund Yourself, it was the former owner of the Buffalo Bills, and his name just so happened to be Ralph, So there's something interesting with how it connects to Buffalo and such. And, and think about O.J. Simpson with Buffalo, and O.J. Simpson, whoever killed his wife stabbed her in the neck a whole bunch of times. That was a big thing. She got stabbed in the neck. And then you think about how Charlie Kirk got shot in the neck, and just right after Charlie Kirk was shot in the neck. There was a story that the guy who tried to assassinate Donald Trump tried to stab himself in the neck. And of course, that does have interesting parallels back to Freemasonry and the story of Hiram Abiff, right? Hiram Abiff that gets stabbed in the neck by the three ruffians. And they said there was a 33-hour manhunt for Tyler Robinson, the guy who supposedly killed Charlie Kirk. And the word neck equals 33, right? Let's just type it out really quick. The word neck equals 33. Of course, in Scottish Rite Freemasonry, the highest degree is 33. This really big number within Freemasonry, such as the headquarters in Washington, D.C., that have the 33 pillars that are all 33 feet tall outside, and you have to be a 33rd degree Mason to be a member. I mean, if you go back to the DeMar Hamlin videos I have, I'm not even going to go into it, but it was all about the number 33 and genuflecting and Freemason rituals. Pretty interesting, when you really look at it. And, even remember I don't even know, that Buffalo game, or the Broncos game, where they came back down 33 points, right? They came back down by 33. It was connected to this Midtown Manhattan shooter that supposedly killed himself on the 33rd floor. And he was trying to kill the NFL office and his birthday, or he went to the same high school as John Elway. A bunch of stuff here. John Elway's birthday is 6/28. This shooting happened at 6:28 at night. But tried to kill himself on the 33rd floor. Then we just got the New York Jets guy who was shot out right after UFC 322. New York equals 33, But that was 111 days after this shooter in Midtown Manhattan. And that guy, the Jets player, just got shot in Midtown Manhattan. But New York equals 111. But, the Broncos came back down 33 points against New York, and New York equals 33. I pointed out how they won with 33 points, and the drive started with 33 seconds. And the Giants also missed 2 extra points, which helped them win. And the extra points are now from the 33-yard line. The Broncos won the game because their kicker kicked a field goal, and his name is Will Lutz, who equals 33. I talked about the connection to my cousin, who is a big Broncos fan, who also used to coach at Sacramento State, where Cam Scadaboo went, and he's 33 years old. And the Broncos also won Super Bowl 33. So there's a whole bunch of interesting parallels here to the number 33 and such, but I'll talk about it a little bit more here in a second. But another weird synchronicity is that I was thinking about the stabbing in the neck and all that, and just getting shot in the neck. And I remember my friend Shannon got stabbed in the neck years ago, and I couldn't remember when it was. So I looked it up on Facebook, and he just so happened to get stabbed on 3/24/2013, right? What are the odds that my friend would get stabbed in the neck at the bar on the date 324? And even more interesting is that like a week before this, at the bar 10 miles away, not even 10 miles away, there was a shooting, and it was Cheers Bar. And there was a shooting where another guy got shot and died, right? And murdered. And it's just weird. There's a shooting right outside of Cheers Bar just before my friend got stabbed in the neck. And remember how the owner of Cheers just went to jail on 3/10 the same day, connected to OJ and Puff Daddy, and he used to own a Bronco that looked like OJ's. And, my friend who got stabbed in the neck, he got stabbed outside of the bar that equals 33. It's like, it doesn't always mean that. I've tried to make this point forever. Yes, I do think there is an elite, and there are people within Freemasonry and the Catholic Church and whatever. They have these, I think they are part of a club that is, has power over the world and using this knowledge. I don't disagree with that. But I think that they also want us to have that belief. They created this conspiracy movement on purpose, and they try to guide our thoughts with certain things. It's no secret. They, like Tim Russert equals 322, the guy who supposedly exposed Skull and Bones. They wanted us to know about that. You know what I mean? Just like Abe Lincoln and the Jesuits and so on, right? They wanted us to know about that. They wanted us to believe that it's the Jesuits and whatever. And I really think that it's something bigger. And a lot of times what people do is they take all of these stories, and sure, you can find these parallels to like Freemasonry and such, but it's like it seems like they want us, they know that we've been studying this, and they know that they created a movement who is studying this. So they do some of these things kind of on purpose to make you think that they are responsible because of the connections with gematria, which don't always make it true. Even though you can point out the parallels, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's what it is. And I know it's hard for people's minds to register what I'm talking about, but it is created, and they control your thoughts and so on. This is what I've talked about with the umbrella symbolism for years. But a lot of people just get mad about it, and they're like, "Oh, this guy, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He thinks that the Jesuits aren't responsible, and look at all these connections that we've made, but we can't explain them connections as to why they chose this phrase over this phrase and everything else." But it doesn't mean there isn't a cabal, and it doesn't mean that they're not somewhat responsible. It's just the way people connect it a lot of times doesn't necessarily prove it. Especially when I think they want us to have these beliefs. Like, people will use the example of Tim Russert being some really good guy exposing skull and bones, but then they don't point out that he went to a Jesuit university, but with everybody else they say, he's a Jesuit because he went to a Jesuit university. So why would Tim Russert, according to the logic, Tim Russert is a Jesuit, and then Tim Russert's the Jesuit exposing skull and bones? How does that make any sense, It's because it seems to me that it was all like done on purpose that way. But moral of the story, my friend's name even sums to 74, another number that people would say means Masonic and such. But I guarantee the Freemasons didn't come to this town and make this other guy, make these guys get in a bar fight, or whatever else. But the odds that he'd be stabbed in the neck on 3/24, it's interesting. Especially when it happened out, just a week after another guy got murdered at Cheers, 10 minutes away from where I live. Another interesting thing too, though, in relation to Freemasonry, is a lot of people were pointing out this movie Snake Eyes with the Charlie Kirk stuff. And basically in this movie Snake Eyes with Nicolas Cage, the opening of the movie takes place at a boxing match, and the favorite to win is Tyler the Executioner, and there's a politician named Charles Kirkland who gets assassinated by being shot in the neck at this boxing fight or boxing match. And Charlie Kirk was supposedly assassinated by a guy named Tyler. So think about Tyler the Executioner and Charles Kirkland and Charlie Kirk, and they both get shot in the neck. And the movie's also called Snake Eyes, and right now we're in the year of the snake. And of course, later people were pointing out how if you go back to the old VHS tapes, there's a movie called Dead Man on Campus, the one that has Zach Morris or Mark Paul Gosselaar. And in the previews of that, they have a preview of the movie Snake Eyes, which is interesting, thinking about Charlie Kirk, the dead man on campus. So this movie, Dead Man on Campus, the previews on the old VHS have the movie Snake Eyes, where the guy Charles Kirkland gets assassinated. Further, if you go to the Dead Man on Campus, or the Snake Eyes one, it has a preview for the movie Dead Man on Campus, right? And also, in the opening of the previews of Dead Man on Campus, they have a preview for the South Park movie, right? Bigger, longer, uncut. So no doubt it all does seem to be perfectly planned. Another movie that a lot of people I didn't see point out, but the previews to Snake Eyes also has the preview for The Truman Show. And The Truman Show is all about how the world is staged and scripted, right? It's pretty interesting that would also be in the trailer for Snake Eyes. And, he learns the truth after the star Sirius falls from the sky, or the camera Sirius falls, and then he learns the truth. And, the all-seeing eye that has the light behind it on the back of the dollar bill actually represents Sirius, which is the blazing star in Freemasonry, where you get your illumination from. So just interesting that that movie was also in the previews. Another thing people pointed out was that triangle hand symbol, right? The cover of this movie, Snake Eyes, where they're doing the Illuminati triangle hand sign, something that Charlie Kirk often did, right? And even, Donald Trump and Elon Musk supposedly were doing that as a tribute to Charlie Kirk and so on. They tried to make it look like it was just out of respect for Charlie Kirk when, most likely it was something to do with the Illuminati stuff that goes on. But something that stands out to me with this hand pose is that, this number 324, like I said, I feel like when I first started having synchronicities with it, it was leading me to pay attention to Zachary Hubbard, right? And what's interesting is there's like multiple videos where, he also has done this same symbol, like with his hands, right? He wasn't even explaining about the Illuminati, like when he was doing this. And then there's like that video he did with Net Void, where she's interviewing him and he's standing like, it's just an awkward position to stand. I've never stood like that in my entire life. Maybe people do. I don't know. It's awkward. I always thought that was the weirdest shit. Like, who stands like that? Like, that doesn't even look comfortable, But in relation to the number 33 in composite numbers, notice in this video he's wearing that Malcolm Butler shirt with Malcolm Butler, it was all about number 21 in that Super Bowl. And the 21st composite just so happens to be 33. But in relation to the Mormons, so probably the most famous person that Zach's ever had on his radio show was Larry Johnson, the football player. I noticed Larry Johnson also has pictures doing that same triangle hand symbol. But, and Larry Johnson was on there all by the numbers. Can't remember it all. It was right before the 49ers and the Chiefs played in the Super Bowl. And it was on January 22nd, 122, like how Kansas City equals 122, like how San Francisco equals 122. And it was synced up to his birthday and Zach's birthday and a bunch of stuff, But, he's doing that hand symbol as well. And if you go back to when I talked about how Larry Johnson first started sharing gematria, look at my blog post. I also talked about the Mormons. So in the same post where I'm talking about Larry Johnson talking about gematria, I'm talking about the Mormons. And that's why I'm bringing this up. And that's why I feel like it's somehow related to this, And everything about Zach, there's been a million things with the number 33 and Zach forever. And once again, that doesn't mean that he's a Freemason, maybe. But there's some interest, I don't know, it makes you wonder. It really does. There's something weird about it. But like, you can come watch some of these other videos. I have just watch my umbrella video playlist, my umbrella playlist here. I talk about all of these 33s. I'm talking about just tons of them, His first ever blog post was 3 months and 3 days after his birthday. And in 2016, he started the website All for Truth. And he was trying to raise money for that. And he's trying to raise $33,000 while he was 33 years old. And then we were following the Colts that year, which is interesting. And then the Colts ended up getting eliminated on the playoffs on Christmas Eve. And they lost to a team who scored 33 points on them. And that was the same day that Zach's house got crashed into, or his garage actually got crashed into by a car, while he was in the 33rd state, Oregon. Of course, garage equals 33, and the police report, they signed off on the report at the 33rd minute of the day, and police equal 33. And when Zach was showing the footage of his house and all that, he showed, I don't know if I pulled it up here, but, he showed that letter G in the sighting or whatever, right? And the big G, the capital letter G is 33. And, even on Gematria Affects Sports right here, on the little logo, he highlights only I, A, C, and T. Add them up, that's 33. For a long time, he wore them little orange glasses, right? The orange tinted glasses. Well, orange equals 33. Literally, sweet lady equals 33. Remember in 2022, there was all of the truth rallies and stuff, and that was inspired by a guy from the Oklahoma City bombing dying, which was that story was 3 months and 3 days before the Oklahoma City rally, where Timothy McVeigh died at the age of 33. And that Oklahoma City rally happened 3 months and 3 days before Zach's birthday. Then 33 days later, Zach went to Buffalo to have the Buffalo rally. Of course, that was the same year as the Denver Broncos stadium fire, and that Super Bowl that year, the Bengals versus the Rams was all synced up to Zach. And they even made sure to tell us that the Bengals, or the Rams coach, Sean McVay, they had a story about his father named Tim McVay. Then Cooper Kupp was the MVP, and he was from Yakima, where Zach had lived. And then later that year, Cooper Kupp's grandpa bought Zach's house, and Zach talked to him about gematria and such, and said that, and then that grandpa said that he knows Peyton Manning, and he has Peyton Manning's phone number, and he knows Peyton Manning isn't in on the rigging and such. And it's like, Peyton Manning, the guy from the Denver Broncos and the Colts. And remember the Umbrella Man threatened Zach to watch for Christmas Eve, and then the car crashed into his garage on Christmas Eve, and that was right after Zach had started All for Truth, where they used the umbrella logo. And then, that following year on John Elway's birthday, June 28th, that was the day they took down Zach's first ever channel on YouTube. So once again, going back to that Colts and Broncos narrative, Zach even had the Colts versus the Giants in that Super Bowl that year, 2016. The Colts versus the Giants, which have that connection back to Daniel Jones. And remember, the other big truth rally in 2022 was the rally in New York on 9/11, right? And there was umbrellas everywhere. Like, it was raining. It was the most umbrellas I've ever seen in any live stream in my entire life. Umbrellas everywhere. And I was talking about the umbrella symbolism all year with all of that and how it was related. And then that 9/11 rally, umbrellas everywhere. Then the next day, on Andrew Luck's 33rd birthday, Zach went to Yale to educate about skull and bones, right? And then just after that, he hit a pothole or something and had to come home. It was like he went to educate about skull and bones on Andrew Luck's 33rd birthday. Of course, Andrew Luck was the player for the Colts in 2016, right? And of course, right after the 2019 Tisha B'Av that everybody was following, that's when Andrew Luck announced his retirement from the NFL. And it just so happened to be on August 24th, which is August 11th on the Julian calendar. And remember earlier that year, Julian Edelman won the MVP of the Super Bowl, and Julian Assange was arrested. And I was pointing out how I think we should pay attention to the Julian calendar. And then August 11th, the Tisha B'Av date of the Julian calendar, was the day that Andrew Luck announced that he was retiring from the NFL. Even more odd is that the same day that Zach went to Yale on Andrew Luck's 33rd birthday, the guy with the Umbrella Man channel that told him to watch out on Christmas Eve, and then a car crashed into his garage, he posted a video on a different channel that was called Skull and Bones. And remember, the Buffalo rally just happened to be on Alfonso Taft's birthday, and Alfonso Taft is one of the co-founders of Skull and Bones. It was also on Josh Allen's birthday. Josh Allen equals 33. And remember that girl that was following him around everywhere, and he got mad at her and started talking crap? Her name was Angel Baby. Guess what Angel Baby equals? 33. So it just seems to me there's a million other 33s around Zach too, But like, such as how he wanted to have a truth rally in Oklahoma City with a 33-minute video. And, he got bear sprayed at Powell's bookstore all by the number 33 as well. In the 33rd state. But, it's something to do with composite numbers. It's interesting he's doing this pose. Number 21 is the 21st composite is 33. Then I'm talking about Larry Johnson, the most famous guy that's ever been on his radio show or, had a podcast with Zach. And he's doing this as well. And my old post about him has to do with the Mormons. There is a relationship here. I'm supposed to see something with this, Even more interesting is the fact that around the time of the Buffalo rally, there was a story about how there was an assassination attempt to assassinate George Bush. And that was 322 days after George Bush's birthday, that big skull and bones number. But George Bush equals 324. And it's interesting, we've had all that 9/11 symbolism that's going on. Zoran Mondani being elected, and the UPS airline crash, and the guy named Islam beat the Madalena guy in UFC 322. And Madalena actually translates to Magdalene, which means tower in Hebrew. So the guy named Islam beat the guy whose last name means tower at UFC 322. Then a few hours later, the New York Jets player guy got shot in the stomach. Another thing that happened was Vice News actually showed up at that Buffalo rally. And remember, Vice News was one of the two mainstream articles that have ever been written about Zach. The other one was The Big Lead, and that one was the one talking about the Denver Broncos in the Super Bowl, and it had the cover picture with Peyton Manning on it. And, they even talked about the Freemasons in that article. I don't even know if you can find that article anymore, but it's just interesting, it involved Peyton Manning, the Denver Broncos, reminding us of Vice News showing up at the Buffalo rally right after the Denver Broncos stadium fire that was on Peyton Manning and Damar Hamlin's birthday. See, there's a big interrelated relationship here. Further, I was looking at my old Larry Johnson blog post, and there's another one where Larry Johnson said Dwayne Wade was a Freemason, something to do with his son being a girl now or whatever. But somebody had commented, and they posted this picture of Larry Johnson doing the Illuminati triangle thing, right? And when I looked that person up, their picture on Twitter just so happens to be a picture of the Buffalo Bills stadium. It's like, huh. So there's something, some way it's related, Also, Larry Johnson's interview with Zach, it was right around the time of Dr. Paul Cottrell just randomly reaching out to Zach a whole bunch of times while he was in Louisiana. That equals 201. And he was trying to tell him about Event 201, and Dr. Paul Cottrell equals 201. And, his thumbnail when he did a video with Zach, he used the umbrella logo. And I'm talking about the umbrella with mind control. It was also why Zach was staying at the Treme Hotel that equals 186, the big umbrella number. But Zach was staying at room 201 where this guy kept trying to reach out to him. And I'm trying to tell you that it seems that, we're all being programmed with this umbrella symbolism and mind control. And it led us to believe that everything was connected to the Jesuits. And what I'm saying is I feel like we are being guided to have that belief. And I don't know why people get so mad about me saying that. We're being guided to have that belief everything was the Jesuits, because that's what they wanted us to believe. But in relation to South Park, remember South Park got banned in China just before coronavirus, and South Park, the next episode after being banned in China was an episode called Shots, where Cartman turned into a pig every time they tried to give him his vaccine. And that was interesting because 2019 was a year of a pig in Chinese astrology, right? So Cartman turned into a pig every time they tried to give him his vaccine. Then coronavirus came a few months later, and they blamed it on China and such. Of course, the other episode that season was Mexican Joker, and it all had to do with the new Joker movie coming out. And of course, remember the Batman shooting in 2012 that in the previews of that movie, they had the James Bond movie Skyfall, and they showed the big building in China that says Aurora on it. Then Aurora, Colorado supposedly got shot up. Of course, Aurora, Colorado was where John Kerry was born, and John Kerry, a member of Skull and Bones, and they showed that number 322 before they blow up the stadium. And Batman's great-great-grandfather in the 33rd episode of Batman, the TV series, they say that his great-great-grandfather was the founder of Skull and Bones. And oddly enough, right now, we're in the 324th year of Yale being founded. Yale, where Skull and Bones is from. And think how George Bush equals 324. In relation to South Park, too, remember in 2015, South Park had this episode called Naughty Ninjas? I mean, South Park's just like The Simpsons, tons of predictive programming, but they had this episode called Naughty Ninjas where all the boys dressed up like ISIS. And notice it came out on November 11th, 2015. So just a couple days before the Paris, France ISIS attack. But all the boys dressed up like ISIS. That was a big thing in the they were ninjas, but everybody thought they were ISIS. And then ISIS attacked Paris, France. And, right around the same time, we got the story of Charlie Sheen announcing he had HIV. And then there was a story of the Missouri Tigers. There was a hunger strike at the Missouri Tigers campus. And remember, Charlie Sheen said he had tiger's blood. And this was just after Taylor Swift had won all them awards at the VMAs for her song Bad Blood. And it was linked up to Freddie Mercury, the guy who had bad blood, and a whole bunch of stuff, But I'm just pointing this out because the same day that Charlie Kirk died, Netflix released that documentary about Charlie Sheen. There's also a story in the news about King Charles and Prince Harry getting back together. So there was something going on with this theme, But South Park had this episode called Naughty Ninjas right before the Paris, France terrorist attack. And South Park also has the movie Team America that opens up with a terrorist attack in France. And then the next scene is they go back to America and there's a guy, the main character, he's in a Broadway show called Everyone Has AIDS, right? So Everyone Has AIDS. The thing about how Charlie Sheen announced he had HIV right around the same time. Synced to Taylor Swift and Bad Blood and the Missouri Tigers hunger strike. But I'm bringing this up just because I went back and looked at that episode, and the interesting thing was that if you read out the title of the episode, it just so happens to equal 324. Naughty Ninjas equals 324. And it was the 264th episode of South Park. Remember, Trey Parker equals 264. The 264th composite is 332. This other number that I'm talking about that seems to be related to this connection, especially with Charlie Kirk dying in connection to the, 332 days after his birthday, after the 332nd episode of South Park aired. Something going on there. There's been just tons of stories that remind me of the Denver Broncos too. And like I said, I don't know if the Beans are going to be at the Super Bowl, or if it's maybe the Colts or the Bills. It's just some weird stuff. Everything seems to be connected to the Denver Broncos, though. Like, we got this story about the re-investigation to Hunter S. Thompson's death. And if you go back and look at a bunch of stuff I've talked about with the Broncos and the Buffalo Bills, there's a movie with Bill Murray where he portrays Hunter S. Thompson. It's called Where the Buffalo Roam. And in that movie, he has a dog named Bronco. And also, just before Super Bowl 50 that the Denver Broncos won, there was a bunch of stories about motorcycles in the news. And, Hunter S. Thompson used to live with the Hells Angel in San Francisco. And Super Bowl 50 was held in San Francisco at Levi's Stadium, or the San Francisco Bay. So it just seems strange to me there would be a story about Hunter S. Thompson in the news after all these years. Once again, he has that connection back to the Broncos and the Buffalo Bills. And his name also equals 72 frontwards and backwards, and he died 7 months and 2 days after his birthday at Buffalo Bills equals 72. Bills also equal 324 in Sumerian, just Bills. One thing I forgot to point out in relation to Freemasonry, too, and Mormonism, is that Joseph Smith was a Freemason. A few years ago, they had the story of the earthquake in Salt Lake City, and it damaged the trumpet on the Angel Moroni statue. And when you look at the building and such, they all have a bunch of Freemason symbols on it. And even if you look up Freemasonry within Mormonism, they say that the origin of the temple rituals are directly related to the story of Hiram Abiff, right? So Hiram Abiff and the stuff with the neck, and Charlie Kirk connected to the Mormon symbolism. It's like, there is a big connection here with Freemasonry and such. I'm not doubting that. It's just that sometimes I just think they want us to connect all these dots to it. Also, right around the time of Charlie Kirk's death, there was a big boxing match with Terrence Crawford, right? Reminding us of Tyler, the executioner in the movie Snake Eyes and such. And I just find it interesting that he's from Omaha. Omaha has the Mormon Bridge and so on. And his nickname is Bud, that equals 324. And that Mormon church that got shot up was on his birthday. And oddly enough, my friend Sturgill, he like met a UFC fighter years ago at some bar, and he became friends with him. And he's been on like a UFC website, like chugging a beer out of a shoe or something. And he goes to all the fights. You know, he even knows like Terrence Crawford a little bit. At one point, I remember some of Terrence Crawford's cousins were in my town, and they were staying at his apartment because they were trying to hide from the cops or something. But like I said, my best friend's birthday is the 324th day of the year, so uh, there's just something going on there, you know? I don't know how that completely relates, but I think it's just because I'm supposed to see the number 324. And I don't know, maybe it's some. There's a big boxing narrative with Russia and Ukraine as well, and next year's the horse year, and I think that next year is going to be the big year. I think with Russia and Ukraine, it just seems to be, you know, with the Trident and the Neptune stuff. It just seems that next year will be the big year, especially with the Russian guy named Islam who just defeated the guy with the last name that means Tower at UFC 322. It just seems to be the year of the horse. But a long time ago, I met a famous boxer from Omaha. Had a band gig, and this guy told me he was a famous boxer, and his name's Dickie Ryan, and he actually is a famous boxer. But he lost to James Buster Douglas, the guy who beat Mike Tyson and such. So, also the angel Moroni equals 33. I saw I put that in there. Just kind of go through these really fast. I need to stop this video. I've started this video like back in October, and I figured I would just finish it because I made one about the Jets the other day and the 9/11 symbolism that's going on TikTok. But O.J. Simpson, all the neck stuff. Talked about that. Sorry, I'm just going through here trying to piece it all together. Yeah, once again, that boxing narrative. The boxing narrative seems to go back to Russia and Ukraine. I have a whole bunch of videos on this. My cousin Colton, too, you know, he's a Broncos fan and his name's Colton, right? Like the Colts and the Broncos. Let's see here. Well, YouTube restricted a video about Jesus that involved Jesus again. They already restricted this video a long time ago. I don't know how they could restrict the video, but they restricted one of my videos and some connection to Dubai there. Talked about this 33-point comeback already. Oh, I had synchronicity with this movie Premonition and the beginning of November or the end of October. But basically, this Netflix showed this movie for me to watch, and I started watching it, and then the next day, I didn't finish it. I only watched like 15 minutes. And the next day, I was at work, and I realized that I've actually seen this movie before, and I've blogged about it. So when I was at work, I was looking at my blog post about this movie, and I talked about how the clock or the cat clock in that movie reminds me of Back to the Future, and because there's a similar clock in the movie Back to the Future. And I thought that was interesting because when I looked at this blog post, I thought it was interesting because Netflix had also been recommending the movie Back to the Future for me to watch. So I was like, huh, what the heck? I started watching Premonition, and now Netflix is showing me to watch Back to the Future. And my old blog post about Premonition is connecting it to the movie Back to the Future and the clock. So I went back and I was looking at my Back to the Future clock videos, and there just so happens to be a Denver Broncos clock in the movie Back to the Future. And remember, Back to the Future was all about 9/11. There's a ton of symbolism with 9/11 and Back to the Future. Remember even the part where the father in the future is upside down and the the TV moves and it looks like the towers, the Twin Towers are collapsing and such. But in that second movie, I don't think it was Crispin Glover, the actor who played the father, but in the first movie it was Crispin Glover, which makes me think there has to be some kind of connection to that Pokemon card that I found at work that said Crispin on it and the father symbolism. But it's just pretty interesting. There's a Denver Broncos clock in the movie Back to the Future, and I'm having synchronicity with it, and I go back and look, and I'm talking about a Broncos clock that is in the movie. And then, of course, Michael J. Fox, remember, he performed with Coldplay last year, and Coldplay just had the Kiss Cam stuff that was connected to the Denver Broncos, and the Coldplay also played the Super Bowl halftime show with Beyonce at Super Bowl 50 where the Broncos won. So, and that had to do with father symbolism. The song that they played, I believe it was a song that was written for the singer's girlfriend's because her father had just died or something like that. It was crazy. It had to do with father symbolism. There's also a point in Premonition where the black cat clock, the hands are on 9 and 11. And in the movie Back to the Future, the first one, there's the Enchantment Under the Sea dance, right? And it has the statue of Neptune holding the trident. So once again, it goes back to that horse narrative. I'm trying to think what else. Oh, and then I was looking up Premonition, and the dad who actually dies in this movie, or that's what the Premonition is about, is the father who dies, right? The father. The actor who played that father, he actually died on July 2nd of this year. He died on July 2nd. And, I had that synchronicity 122 days after he died, and San Francisco equals 122. If you look at this guy up, he got his acting start in a Levi's commercial, right? Reminding me of Super Bowl 60 that's going to be at Levi's Stadium in the San Francisco Bay. And I pointed out his name, Julian. Made me think of the Julian calendar stuff, but I also mentioned Ed McMahon just because his last name was McMahon. And then I looked up Ed McMahon and I realized I always thought he was a Publishers Clearinghouse guy, right? Apparently that's a Mandela effect. Ed McMahon never did Publishers Clearinghouse ever. It was like American Publishers House or something. Something very similar. But like tons of people remember Ed McMahon being the Publishers Clearinghouse guy. Apparently it wasn't. But it makes me think of the Earling, Iowa stuff and the priest who died on my father's birthday and how he won Publishers Clearinghouse. So once again, there's a weird narrative going on here. But we also had Marshawn Kneeland, right? The guy with the last name Kneeland, whose last game was the same day as Colin Kaepernick's birthday, the guy who took a knee, the guy who played for San Francisco. I'm running out of space here, but he died, and he played for the Western Michigan Broncos, and he was born in the San Francisco Bay, or he died in Frisco, Texas. That's what it was. Frisco, Texas, like reminding us of San Francisco. I also watched this movie called The Black Phone too, and I'm going to skip over it because I'm running out of time, but there's actually a part in the movie where they show a kid with a Denver Broncos jacket in the movie. It's like, so there's just a bunch of connections to the Denver Broncos. I don't know what it all means, but 324, Denver Broncos, huge interrelated narrative. I'm sure it's confusing for a lot of people, but I'm going to end the video here because I've run out of space. Have a good one. Peace.